Welcome everyone to the February meeting of the Calgary Police Commission. I would like to call this meeting to order and ask that everyone ensure their microphones are muted until you need to speak. My name is Sean Cornett and I am the chair of the commission. Present from the commission are Commissioners Amtul Siddiqui, Marilyn North Pagan, Susan Mallon, Kim Lynch Proctor, Heather Campbell, Teresa Rossell, Pam Karnick, TJ Sang, Jeff French, and Councillors Giancarlo Carra and Courtney Walcott. Commissioners Siddiqui and Rossell will be joining us a little bit later. The Calgary Police Service representatives are led by Chief Constable Mark Neufeld. Chief, would you please introduce those you expect to speak during today's meeting?
I think we just need to give CPS a moment to organize. I can see they're on the call, but they don't have video and I don't hear anything from audio yet.
Okay.
Heather, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. We just can't see you.
Sorry, I'm working on that. We just got some new audio visual equipment, so just give me a second.
Okay.
All right, Heather, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you and we can see you. Thanks.
Perfect. So if you could introduce the people you expect to speak in today's meeting.
Yes, for sure. So I'll introduce myself, Joe Farrar, Superintendent and Executive Officer of the Calgary Police Service. Next to me, I have Deputy Chief Chad Topic. On my other side, I have Chief Mark Neufeld, Deputy Chief Katie McCollum, Acting Deputy Chief Stacy Furland, Acting Deputy Chief Ryan Illiv, Inspector Nadine Wagner, Executive Director Rory Thompson, Executive Director William Hutchins, Executive Director Andrea Urquhart, Executive Director Bob Benton, Acting Director Emma Poole. And then we have a number of participants online as well.
Thank you, and thank you for everyone for being here today. For those who are not familiar with our role, the Calgary Police Commission is a body of community members appointed by City Council to provide independent citizen governance and oversight of the Calgary's City Police Service on behalf of Calgarians. To protect the political neutrality of the police, Alberta's Police Act requires that the police chief report directly to us and that we give direction to the service through the chief, police policies, monitoring of the complaints process, and approval of how the police budget is spent. Today is one of 8 public meetings we have each year to openly discuss police governance and oversight matters with the service's leadership and to hear from the public. In addition to these meetings, there are also private monthly committee meetings where commissioners dedicate time to work more directly with the service on various matters that cannot be discussed publicly. To open our meeting, I would like to acknowledge that this call is taking place on the traditional territory of the Niitsitapi, made up of Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, the Arahe Nakota First Nations, comprised of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation. These are the people who made a treaty with the Crown, forming Treaty 7 territory. The city of Calgary is also homeland to the historic Northwest Métis and to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. We are committed to doing our part to address the inequity and intergenerational trauma caused by past and current wrongs to support reconciliation with all Indigenous people in our community. The Calgary Police Commission also condemns racism and prejudice in all forms and is committed to being anti-racist. We stand in solidarity with our colleagues, families, and citizens who are Black, Indigenous, or other people of color. For those joining us for the first time, Please allow me to provide a brief overview of the meeting format. The public session of this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on our website so that we can make it available to those unable to attend. There will be several presentations from the Calgary Police Service, Commission members, and Commission staff. Commissioners will have a chance to ask questions or make comments by raising their hands in Zoom. Once we have completed the presentations, we will move to the public participation portion of the meeting. Anyone who registered to speak before noon today will then be called on by name and will have a chance to either ask a question or make a presentation for our consideration. Following the public participation session, we will close the public portion of the meeting and ask the media and chief to remain on the line with me for a brief media availability. To start our agenda items, I will now call for declarations of pecuniary interest or conflict of interest from the commissioners. Hearing no declarations, I will now ask for approval of the agenda. Does any member of commission wish to request an amendment to the agenda? Councillor Walcott.
Yes, Chair, thank you. I would like to amend the agenda to add a discussion item titled De-escalation and lethal force discussion following the police shooting on February 19th, 2022. And if it would serve the commission and CPS as well too, I'd be happy to provide a brief explanation as to why I would like to do so.
If you want to, brief explanation. I don't think there's a huge problem with that. Go ahead.
Okay, it's perfect. I'll be very, very brief, and then we can go to a vote on whether or not we want to add this item. But I think it would serve, it serves the public good to have this item on the agenda, given kind of what has gone on over the weekend, so that there is a record of the conversation rather than record of a conversation in a public forum. I would also like to really note that this discussion that I would like to pursue is not around the specifics of the case. It cannot be around the specifics of the case. However, there are systemic questions that arise from this incident that directly inform our work on commission and much of the work that goes on within CPS and in the public. The conversation that I'd like to pursue as well is not one where we seek to blame any individual, but rather understand the response model and how it contributed to the shooting. And most importantly, the public session will likely raise questions. And while we cannot answer these questions directly because it's an ongoing investigation, we do have the opportunity to use this conversation to inform and educate the public on some of the nuance that might not have been provided in media releases or news articles. I would even go so far as to suggest that in the future of lethal force events, that this might actually be a standing item that we come back to, and a practice that we consider in the future. But that is why I'd like to ask permission and vote with the rest of commission to add this as an item. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Walcott. And I will say that I'll ask for a second to the motion. Commissioner Campbell.
I would second Commissioner Councillor Walcott's motion to add this item to the agenda.
Okay. And can I have a vote on the motion from the commissioners? Those in favor? Those opposed? I don't see any opposed, so the motion is carried, and we'll put that agenda as 5.1 in the reports. And I will also note that this is a good initial conversation, and we'll manage it as such, and know that there will be other conversations and discussions coming in the future. So thank you very much for bringing this forward. All right, so the next item on the agenda is approval of the consent agenda. For those viewing today's meeting, the consent agenda is a list of routine items that all commissioners agree can be accepted without more discussion or a separate note. Does any member of the commission wish to request an item on the consent agenda be brought forward for discussion? Hearing none, I'll declare the agenda as amended and the consent agenda approved as presented. Thank you. For my chair's report this month, I would like to start by briefly touching on a few of noteworthy items and activities that have occurred since our last meeting. Our commission approved changes to the public participation portion of these meetings to make more meaningful contact, and both for us and for those who take time to speak with us. Members of the public now can choose between providing a written statement, providing a verbal presentation, or asking a verbal question. While these changes are only a small part of the work we have underway to improve how we communicate with and engage the public, our hope is that the new format will improve what we know has been a frustrating part of the meeting for many people. We will continue to make other improvements to how we engage people outside of meetings in the coming months to make sure we are meaningfully connecting with Calgarians on policing issues. There have also been some noteworthy successes this past month by the Calgary Police Service, and I want to recognize them. Members from across the service worked to investigate and remove an encampment outside of the Calgary Drop-In Center that, due to the violence and criminal activity occurring there, had become a barrier that was preventing vulnerable people from accessing these supports that they need. We are pleased to see the service work so closely with partners at the city and in Calgary's nonprofit sector to ensure that when the time came to remove the encampment, it was done with compassion and in a way that helped connect people living there with long-term supports. Over 70 members of the service also worked together with partners to quickly locate a 2-year-old child who was the subject of an Amber Alert at the end of January. Coordinating efforts like this are no small feat, and the service should be proud of this work. Finally, a crime prevention initiative that started here in Calgary was adopted by police services across the province. Operation Cold Start started at the Calgary Police Service 6 years ago and uses a combination of social media campaigns, media relations, and officers talking to owners of vehicles left unsecured and running during the winter months. The campaign was so innovative that the Alberta Association of Chiefs of Police have adopted it as a province-wide initiative this month. On behalf of the Commission, thank you to all of those who were involved in these investigations and initiatives. While there have been a lot of good things this month, our hearts are also very heavy, knowing that this past weekend was a time of loss in our city. Saturday's police shooting was a tragedy, not only for the loved ones of the man who died, but also for our entire community. Our Commission's thoughts are with the family and friends of Mr. Tuel in this time of grief. We also know that the decision to use lethal force is not one that police officers take lightly. The officers involved will no doubt be reliving that moment for the rest of their lives, wondering if there was something they could have done differently. Our thoughts are with them as well. Our Commission has been working with the Calgary Police Service for the last few years to improve the de-escalation practices and use of force options available to officers, and this work remains a priority for us. We are also deeply committed to working with City Council and other levels of government to find better ways of supporting and responding to people in crisis to try and prevent deaths like this in the future. We owe it to both our community and those who serve as officers to tirelessly pursue any innovative approaches that could preserve life. The Chief and the Alberta Serious Incident Response Team shared more details about what occurred through the media release and news conferences yesterday that have provided some answers. However, more answers are still needed, and we trust that the independent investigation that is underway will provide a better picture of what happened in due course. Only limited information about this incident can be discussed publicly to protect the integrity of the ongoing investigation. Because of these limits, much of the conversation our Commission is going to have with service on this incident today has to be during the private portion of this meeting. However, I would like to end my chair's report by asking the Chief to start his public report to the Commission today by sharing anything he can and outlining the next steps. This would be taking into consideration Councillor Walcott's agenda item 5.1. Chief, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Chair. Just for clarity, so we want to renumber the chief's reports, or did you want to add Councillor Walcott's item on is 5.5, but address that first?
The chief's report for sure. My thought was that it would be best to address the issues around the incident first. And then we can go into other items on the chief's report. I will leave it to your discretion though, in terms of how you'd like to bring your items forward.
Perfect, thank you. And we'll call the de-escalation and the briefing on the shooting 5.5. So Chief, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I appreciate your comments opening things up. And again, as you've said, certainly a terrible tragedy, terrible situation in our city. And on behalf, once again, of the men and women of the Calgary Police Service, I also send my sincere condolences to Mr. Tuel's family, friends, obviously the Sudanese community, both here in Calgary and beyond, and then to the community generally. And yes, yesterday was a good time for ACERT to come out. It was timely that they came up with some additional information relative to the investigation. And many had been asking on social media and conventional media for some additional information, and that's understandable. As I've said before, in these cases, ACERT has carriage of the investigation, and so they're able to decide when that happens. And in a situation like this, where you have an incident that occurs in a very busy and a very public location, the potential for many civilian witnesses is great. And if you think about all the media, all the video that we saw floating around, you will know that lots of people had video taken with cameras and stuff. And so there's a lot of investigative work to be done. And so certainly we didn't want to get in the way of any of that or compromise anything, but we certainly felt like there needed to be some additional information come out, in particular to clarify some misinformation that I think began to circulate. That was really in relation, I think, to the weapons that were involved or not involved, kind of the order of events, and then also the manner in which this situation unfolded. It's interesting that you raised the issue of ACERT. I've been in discussions with a number of people from the community, and one of the issues that had come up, or one of the discussions, was that some folks did not understand the fact that, and maybe it's not as apparent to many as it is to us, but some folks didn't recognize that ACERT is actually an independent body and not a unit of the Calgary Police Service. It's actually independent of the police service. And in fact, it's a provincial investigative body that was created by the government of Alberta, basically to investigate and take over situations where there has been serious injury or death to a person as a result of an interaction with a police officer here in the province, or alternatively in cases where perhaps there's a sensitive allegation, such as domestic violence or sexual violence, or obstruction of justice or something like that in relation to a police officer. So practically, when an incident occurs, as was the case on Sunday, police are required by law to notify the provincial director of law enforcement, and then that person makes a decision as to whether or not ACERT is deployed or not. In cases where, like we've seen here, practically that will happen in every case, of course, because certainly it's important in cases where somebody's lost their life. So that's what ends up happening. Just for information quickly, ACERT has two investigative teams. One works in the north and one works in the south. And they basically split the province in half to respond to investigations and incidents that occur. And again, this is so investigations are not then led by the police service that's actually involved in the incident itself. So something that police chiefs in the province advocated for going back to probably 2005, and ACERT was actually became a real entity in 2008. I think importantly here, it's really critical, and I know there's some new commissioners as well. It's important to know that ACERT is actually led by a civilian who's never been a police officer. And so that's something that's actually, there's been some models that have propped up in the country since ACERT was developed, but that's an important feature, I think. That tends to be a trained Crown prosecutor, a seasoned Crown prosecutor, or somebody with that type of training. But yet somebody who has never been a police officer previously, and that individual actually has the ability to lay charges when they believe charges are warranted without any further steps being taken. So again, I think this is a helpful clarification for some who may not have been aware, and it's timely and appropriate to be shared here. Certainly the incident involving Mr. Tuel on Saturday in Forest Lawn is the first police-involved shooting of 2022. And just for context, in 2021, there was 3 officer-involved shooting incidents here in Calgary. All of those involved substance and possession of firearms, actually, or replicas thereof. One person passed away in 2021. In 2020, there was no officer-involved shootings in Calgary, and I believe there were 5 in 2019. All of this to say, these are indeed rare events. They're, though rare, they're obviously unbelievably impactful both on the community and on the police service and on the officers themselves. So if that's an okay introduction, I guess, just in relation to the item itself around de-escalation, maybe it might be prudent to just go to commission for specific questions you may have.
Certainly, thank you. So direct questions, Commissioner Walcott, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and honestly, thank you, Chief, for the context. I really appreciate, just as a quick appreciation to the Commission for allowing this discussion on the agenda. I know it's unorthodox, so, and I also acknowledge the stress and kind of the tragedy that surrounds this. So this conversation, I don't anticipate it to be easy, but I will try and approach it with the utmost respect for the process and most importantly for the people involved. So the kind of the direction of the questions that I want to lead with today are actually very similar to what you described, Chief Neufeld, and it's kind of the context around the shooting and not the shooting itself, right? So I don't like ACERT is involved in that investigation. That is not a conversation for this space, and nor is it time to do so yet. So what I'm most curious about, it starts with the media release and just helping to clarify some things that came out in the media release. In particular, the conversation that came out about how officers attempted to negotiate a peaceful resolution despite their de-escalation efforts. The man's actions led to officers discharging their service weapons. So my question is actually around standard de-escalation efforts. So I just wanted to know if you can describe, or if anyone in the room might support this, to describe what standard de-escalation efforts and methods, usually entail, and what sequence, so that the public might understand what that means in that media statement.
Thank you, Councillor Walcott. I think it's a good question, and I think it's an important one for the public to understand. I think, what's in the public realm in relation to the event, and I know we're not talking about that, but there's a bit in the public realm already around communication, around positioning, which is very important as well. And then also, again, it's in the public realm now that there was a less lethal options, including R1 CW, which we commonly know as a taser, and then also police service dog was present as well. There was also the step taken of having EMS come proactively to the scene and stage there, just recognizing that it's the type of event where there's potential for injury to individuals, whether they be officers, whether they be members of the public or the individual themselves. But in terms of the standard, I guess it's difficult to talk about the standard only because these events don't actually, an event is not an event, it's not an event. But let me expand on that a little. Generally speaking, police are required to resolve situations using no more force than is reasonably necessary in the circumstances. And so it's important to know that the police are subject to the criminal law in the same way that anybody else is. And they can be held accountable, obviously, criminally and also professionally in terms of misconduct for any excesses in terms of use of force. But that said, every situation is different. And so as interactions between police officers and people don't all start in the same place. And so you can appreciate that, sometimes they may begin an interaction, may begin with somebody standing, on the wrong side of a bridge deck because they're despondent, or it might be somebody who is escalated, who's driving a vehicle who was pulled over, or it may involve, going to arrest a suspect at a particular time for a particular crime. There's a number of different situations there that probably factor into that as well. I think, in some cases, I think you're dealing with people, communication is hampered by the fact that you're dealing with people who may be intoxicated, they may be mentally ill, there may be language barriers. There may in fact be noise barriers. I can tell you that if you try to talk to a driver of a vehicle on Deerfoot Trail, you would understand what a noise barrier to that type of communication is. So those all come into it as well. But I can tell you that in every case, the goal of every interaction is to achieve the objective, whatever that may be for the particular call or the response, by achieving voluntary compliance from the individual. So not having to use force if possible. And as you also know from the reports that have been submitted, we submit an annual report on use of force. Very rare, actually, probably less than 1%, and that's being pretty conservative or pretty liberal. Less than 1% of the time that the police deal with the public is any level of force used. So I think that's also important to know. But I think, fundamentally, officers' first tool that they have is their social presence. And we all think about that in terms of, we're driving down the street and we see a police car, and probably most of us put our foot on the brake. Doesn't matter how fast we're going. That's social control. We've been conditioned when we see police to think, of authority and that type of thing, and wonder if we're going too fast. But communication is a big thing. There's nothing, in the training and that sort of thing. Fundamentally, we're looking at basic communication, good communication with people, establishing a rapport, identifying yourself, listening, obviously, being able to let people vent if need be, taking cues from people as to what's important, what might actually make the situation more problematic, what might be a trigger for them, versus something that actually might be really important and a direction you may want to go down. Like I say, officers identify themselves. They ask the other people to identify themselves as a means of establishing rapport. They basically tell people why they're there, what they're trying to do. But all of that, I think, too, is predicated on dealing with a lucid individual, somebody that you're able to communicate with. Let's face it, there's times and situations where things are at a crisis point where there just is no ability to have that communication or to establish that rapport. And in those cases, I would actually say that, when you're talking about a party being in crisis, it's already escalated. And so at that point, sometimes police are called upon to gain control of individuals so that they can be sedated if EMS is there, so that they then can be conveyed to another facility where they can be stabilized, and folks with different skills can apply those skills and support them at the appropriate time. So I guess all of that to say that an incident is not an incident is not an incident. In terms of tactics, officers are trained in everything from empty hand tactics, where they put their hand on somebody's shoulder to effect an arrest, all the way up to lethal force. So they're trained in all of those things. And again, the goal obviously is to resolve these things, and the law frankly is to resolve these things in a manner that involves the least amount of force that is possible. Hopefully that's a long answer to a bit of a complex question.
Chief Chair, if I may, it's my understanding that we're having some difficulty hearing the CPS in the room. We have called IT back, just take a look at our audio equipment. So, mind taking a few second pause just so we can check out the sound in the room, please.
Yeah, happy to do so.
Sorry. Were you able to hear that, Councilor Wolcott?
Yes, it was going in and out, but I could hear it all. It just the sound would like muffle, but I never lost understanding. But
thank you. We'll see what we can do here just to.
Just while we have a moment here, we're waiting for CPS. I note that in the gallery, there are a number of participants today. We welcome you. We are not able to take questions from the gallery during the public session. If you choose to if you want to ask questions and such, there is a need for you to register before noon on the day of the meeting. Otherwise, we can look, you can to get questions afterwards. But unfortunately, we can't take them in the public session of this meeting. So just wanted to note that for people.
Chair, I'm just going to do a sound test. Does that sound any better than before?
Sounds a bit better, yes. It was sort of going in and out, but it does sound much better.
Okay, we've got a number of mics and speakers going on here, so we're going to try to navigate through this, but the chief and everybody else will speak really loudly and slowly. Thanks for sticking around. Thank you so much. So with that being said, we're back.
Okay, just a follow-up question to continue that. Really, it's to, yeah, I guess you spoke about what's in the public realm, and more importantly, you spoke about really understanding what triggers someone, and to really narrow down on this question of what techniques were employed in a de-escalation process. Knowing what we saw in the videos that are out there right now, again, without, like, I don't want us to go into the details of the case, but what would be standard practice for de-escalating a scenario where someone has a weapon on a sidewalk, a knife and a stick? You know, in this, the things that are in the public realm, what would be our standard practice for just understanding that gap, right? That media release says there was de-escalation for a significant amount of time. And I think it would be worthwhile to understand in a general approach how police officers would be trained to handle such a situation, given that that was such a significant part of the media release. So like how that scenario, not cars on a highway, just like what would the de-escalation practices look like in that particular scenario, given the context of the phone call that you received from 911, the information you had available to you, and what was witnessed on the sidewalk, of course.
So Councillor Walcott, it sounds like we're talking specifically about this case, and so that's what we shouldn't do, as you've pointed out. I would say, though, it's important to know that officers going to a situation like that, where you have somebody who is who's reportedly in possession of weapons, you've got a outdoor and a busy location. It's at a busy time of day near quite a public area, as we talked about. Officers are going to be very concerned about, because they don't know at that point what the intention of the person is. And again, whether or not somebody is in a mental health crisis, or whether or not somebody is just committing a criminal act or planning to rob a store or has already done that, they don't really have the benefit of knowing that in many cases. And so when they're responding, sometimes they're responding obviously with much less information than we would have, in the days and weeks to follow. And so it's very easy to sit back and say that, they should have done this or they could have done that. But I think has to be the focus on this type of case, is what did they know at the time? So again, just generally speaking, and again, trying to stay away from the case itself, I think you've got a person in an open air environment. You're very concerned about mobility. There was additional officers that get deployed, and the idea is to keep the person to the best you can without getting too close, because you're dealing with weapons. We want to restrict their mobility so that you can, help to protect other people in the area. Obviously, you don't want them to go into a nearby business. You don't want them to flee, that type of thing. The individual, in a case where you do have somebody in possession of a weapon in a public place, that individual is arrestable. And so they're not going anywhere. And so at the end of the day, that's part of the police tactics, is to use a combination of tactics and communication to isolate and contain, and then obviously speak to the person to try to and develop a rapport to get them to give up the weapon. So that's what officers responding to a situation like that would be thinking about in every case. And again, the knife will be a huge barrier, to communication, and so will the location.
And I really want to, I'd say, like, I appreciate that answer, because I think that was much more aligned with what's going to help people understand kind of the context without the specifics, right? So that was a much more in line with, I think, the intention of the question. So I appreciate that. Just as again, what kind of like follow up is, what's the role of the canine unit in traditional de-escalation process, or just with like, yeah, just how is the canine unit usually deployed? How to, just not specific to the case, just what's a standard scenario in which a canine unit would be present in a scenario and in a situation?
In the context of either an escalating or an already escalated situation, the canine would be very useful there for a couple of reasons. One is if you have somebody in an open air environment who is not contained, they may flee type thing. So you've got the canine there to prevent that. And the other thing, in terms of in the context of de-escalation, what canines tend to do, similar to a CEW, if you have a situation or a taser, if you have a situation where a situation is escalating, if an officer brings out their taser and it's called displaying it and puts the red dot on a person, many people de-escalate because they recognize that this is where this is going. The presence of a canine can do a similar thing. It can also de-escalate a situation if it is escalating. So that's one way that it would be used. But I can tell you in a controlled environment or a controlled situation, there would be no need for the canine and it wouldn't be introduced into that environment.
Okay, and thank you for that. That's very informative. Just kind of like following up on some other questions here for us. It's really a question around timely first aid. I think without, of course, going into anything specific, I think we know very well that this is going to be a topic of conversation that will come up in the future. Could you provide a little information on what the standards and steps are for providing timely first aid? Or even if I think even it might be worth honing in on the sequence of events that impede or enable an officer to administer timely first aid.
Certainly. I've got a couple of trainers in the room here who may help me as well if I falter here, but I can tell you that our folks are trained in first aid and they're also trained in controlling trauma. And they're also trained in situations where they get into a critical incident. If they end up having to use force at whatever level where there's injury, they're also trained to transition into giving first aid. Now, I believe that took place here. I have seen some videos circulate where they were partial videos that didn't show it, but I can tell you, I think it was even in the ACERT release here from yesterday. My understanding is that did take place in this case. And then there's also the situation where supervisors will generally call in calls like this one, will call EMS proactively again to the scene to make sure that that's the case. So officers are trained, and we've seen it over and over again where we've had situations where individuals are injured and officers will come to their aid even after having used force. Anybody want to add to that, or is that good?
That's all I would say. It's also been added into our policy.
Into the use of force policy?
De-escalation support.
Oh, great. Inspector Wagner, just you can't see her here, but she's trying to hide off screen, but she indicated that actually in a recent discussion we've had in relation to the update of the use of force, de-escalation and use of force policy, that's actually been added in also as a duty to care. So that actually exists in policy now and individuals are trained.
Okay. To build up on kind of previous comments about other de-escalation as well too, can you speak to the guidelines around taser use, the RWIN, or I think pepper spray? I know there's another name for it, but when dealing with an individual that doesn't appear to be in possession of like any types of assault rifles, long range weapons, to be honest, I'd even go so far as to ask, is there guidelines around, does like the use of non-lethal force, does it actually have a lot to do with the weapons in possession or even the suspicion associated therefore, like things that you just don't have information on? So just some guidelines on the non-lethal weapons that you employ.
Yeah, so officers who respond in the community there would have access obviously to pepper spray on their belts. Once qualified, they would have access to the CEW, which we also recognize as taser. Some officers have access to RWIN, are qualified for that. Am I missing anything? Baton. Oh yeah, the baton. They also have the baton and that's on their belt as well. And then of course a firearm. So they have a relatively full slate of tools that they can go to. They are trained. There's like the standard by which they're measured in relation to the use of it is, as I mentioned, the criminal code. They're held to the standard of the criminal code. But at the end of the day, they are trained in how to deal with certain situations and certain subject types. We talk often in terms of people who are cooperative, people who are resistors, and then people who are assailants. And if you think about that, somebody who's cooperative, I think that speaks for itself. Somebody who is resistant may just be somebody who, think about a protest situation where somebody just sits, they refuse to leave, but officers have to actually use force to carry them away from the scene. So that would be somebody who would be like a low-level resistor. At higher levels might be somebody who, if you tell a person they're under arrest and they pull away and they try to run, that would be a higher level of resistance. When we talk about assailants, then that is the highest category, and that would be somebody who actually is not trying to resist officers for the purposes of getting away, but is actually trying to harm the officer or somebody else. So we're talking now about very risky behavior, and we're talking about where an officer would be able to use higher levels of force for sure. I think sometimes there's some misunderstanding about there isn't really a situation where you can draw a straight line and say if this then that. I think every situation is dependent, and there's a few things that we look at. We think about subject factors, and when I talk about that, I'm talking about the individual that a police officer is dealing with. We talk about people's size, we talk about their age, we talk about their physical condition and physical abilities, how physically capable they may be, what their motivation is. We talk about things like emotional state, whether they're armed or unarmed, and even the number of subjects that are present would impact it. Another piece that impacts the calculus would be the officer factors. So same types of things: size, age, physical ability or condition, comfort level using a particular type of control mechanism, as an example, the use of force options that are available for the person. If they're not trained or qualified on a CEW, they may not have that, as an example. And then the number of officers present also. And then we also think of things in terms of situational factors, like the location where something happens, the weather conditions, surroundings, what's around you. If something happens, you may be dealing with just one individual outside of a nightclub, as an example, where you're dealing with a bunch of intoxicated people around. The officer may be very concerned about what would happen if he or she was to be taken to the ground. So that may go into their thinking about what types of use of force to use. But I think certainly weapons, when they're introduced into the situation, are very much a significant concern, I think. And they do certainly go into the calculation for officers in terms of what level of force they use.
Thank you for that. The next question is a little higher level. So it has been widely reported that Mr. Tuel was an ex-child soldier. I want to acknowledge quickly before I go into the question that you couldn't have known that at that time. But as part of your community policing approach and the high percentage of immigrants residing in that particular area who come from a wide variety of kind of diverse backgrounds, I just would like, could you speak to what training has been done to prepare for culturally responsive de-escalation practices? And just to provide a little context, the area that stands out for me the most is kind of the potential trigger that a K-9 unit might be for someone with a very particular background that even I myself have personal experience with regards to culturally responsive understandings of and culturally informed care. So that's for the impetus of the question is what is the training that's been done to prepare for culturally responsive de-escalation that would come from inferences and not from kind of reports that would come from 911. It's a little murkier, it's a little bit more of a gray area, a lot of critical thinking involved, so much harder to answer, but I felt the need to pose the question anyway.
I think you're quite right. I think it's a good question to ask. It is a hard one. And I think, it's kind of depends what information would come in based on the way that a call is reported. So, I think of, generally speaking, a call of somebody on the street where strangers are calling in because they're concerned about their safety or concerned about behavior. Those sometimes you actually don't have very much information specifically. in relation to, sort of the person's background or what could be triggers or what could be helpful. If somebody calls and they're concerned about a loved one who's at home, they can provide a lot of information to the police before they come there, which actually can be very helpful. So this is a little bit of a different situation, I think, where, it depends on what officers know. But I think too, when you think about situations like this, you can bring all these things to bear in situations that are stable. And once they're stabilized, then there's lots of time and space to do this. And a lot of the barriers that are created by weapons, as an example, those go away. But so initially, when you're in the stabilization mode, it is very difficult. And all of it depends also on people being able to communicate and how fast things sort of escalate or de-escalate or how long they go on. So again, one of these calls is not a call, is not a call, it's not a call. But certainly, I think we're well positioned with our diversity advisory boards and the work we do with community. I've heard, and I feel comfortable talking about this. You've made the point about the references to Mr. Tuel being a child soldier and some of the experiences in South Sudan. And so like that's very important. Those are types of things that would be good for our officers to know. Again, depending on the situation, and having to stabilize the situation, they may be able to make more and less of it. And I think with our relationships with the community and our anti-racism committee, I think we have the mechanisms there to be able to get, that cultural sensitivity and to incorporate those pieces into our training. But again, these situations I would suggest are far from perfect, and they're very dynamic when they occur. And so, the gold standard or the hope would be to be able to have the best amount of information and the best amount of time and the best amount of support from community or people that maybe know the individuals involved, to be able to take the time and take a very trauma-informed approach to communicating in a way that's empathetic and reassuring. But it simply doesn't always unfold that way. And so, sometimes I think frontline police officers, they get the cards they're dealt with. And sometimes the hand is less than ideal.
Can I just add one point?
Sure, certainly.
Commissioner Walcott, just want to add a point there. The Chief mentioned earlier, we have this new de-escalation and use of force policy. So as part of the creation there, it was done with multiple stakeholders, one of which was the external anti-racist committee. So specific to your question around sort of what has influenced the de-escalation part of it, that was a key component. And as we speak as well, the internal anti-racist committee is actually going through our annual training on de-escalation to provide feedback on how we can make it more akin to and more culturally centered with an ED&I lens as well. So they're just sort of two sort of small high-level points to build on what the Chief said. And also just one on training with regards to your comment around the child soldier. Members go through brain story training, which is ultimately trauma-informed training that is focused on childhood and the development of the brain all the way through their lives. So members go through that training. We have a great relationship for the Phalix Foundation, who are the ones who actually deliver and support that training. And we've got a meeting ongoing right now where we're going to deliver it service-wide, because right now it's just to a few of our members. So the intent there is ultimately really amplify the learning across the service, which will build on your point there about trauma from a young age.
Thank you. And I know that a lot of the points that are being brought up will be conversations that will be a part of a different, committees down the line. This is a part of a lot of work that will need to happen. So I appreciate that detail. I'm almost done, for better or for worse. The next question I have here is with regard to kind of the information that we're seeing on social media, and this in particular, it's separate from the case itself, but impacting of course, the way that this scenario is being viewed in the public realm. And it's in particular with an image that's going around where an officer that attending the scene was wearing a thin blue line patch. And then there was an interaction that was reported on social media afterward regarding the member of the community speaking to said officer about the patch. And I just raised the question of, since it's not directly associated with the case itself, if you can just confirm the authenticity of this image, if you've seen it, just so that we might be able to continue figuring out what communication is required and what work is being required in the future on the particular topic of the Thin Blue Line.
I did see the image that you're speaking of there on a social media feed of a local activist, and that's somebody, to my knowledge, that has a strong bias against the police. So I wouldn't confirm the authenticity of anything on that particular feed. But what I would say, I don't necessarily feel qualified, to talk about how anybody might feel around that. But I can tell you, we've had extensive conversations there between the service and the commission around the topic of Thin Blue Line, and those are continuing. But what I also would say to you is that I myself have had numerous conversations over the last number of days with members of the community, and a number of things have come up, a number of which you've raised in the discussion here. That has not come up at all. So at the end of the day, I'd give you that just as factual information, but that has not been an issue that's been raised by outside of the activist community even once.
Well, and to build on it, it's not just the activist community, but commission itself, the Canadian Association of Police Governance. The Thin Blue Line it's not a new conversation. So I do believe it is worthwhile to understand how that patch is being used in a scenario like this. But I understand your reticence and truthfully told, like, inability to confirm based off of the fact that it is a source off of social media. The final questions are relatively very straightforward. What's the average length of time for ACERT's investigation? So there's maybe a little bit of an expectation for the public of what we might see coming through. I know there's no way of telling us exactly how long an investigation will take, but just on average, just so people might be better informed.
Yes, I think that's an important question. And I don't want to put Commissioner Lynch-Proctor on the spot as the chair of the COC. I know that there was a report that actually came not that long ago in relation to the number of outstanding ACERT files that we had and the length of time on average it was taking. I don't remember the exact amount of time, and you may not either, Commissioner Lynch-Proctor. So again, not to put you on the spot, but it's suffice to say that the investigations, the criminal investigations for ACERT have been taking a significant period of time. I would say that, depending on the workload and the orientation of the organization, 18 to 24 months hasn't been inordinate. I also know that there's been some changes recently, and that this is highly on the radar of the provincial government. Certainly, I know that there's been strong advocacy by the Calgary Police Commission, as there has been by the CPS and the AACP, because I think it's very important. And this case that we talk about here is a very a good example of why there needs to be, a resolution brought forward as quickly as possible and information available to the public. So I can't speak to how long it will take, because again, I think we're in a bit of a different place where they're searching for some efficiencies and trying to do some things differently. So I'm hopeful it'll be less time, but it has been inordinately long. And I think, anybody could Google that and see that there's been issues around resourcing.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. And no, and even just the generic range of 18 to 24 months, like, we can acknowledge is a very long time, but that is a normal experience that is hopefully being addressed, but it speaks a lot to the resourcing that is given to ACERT. Speaking to just, again, follow up with some of the information that might be able to be released to the public. This is the last kind of hard question, I would say. The last one's about resources for the people involved. The body cameras, can you confirm whether or not body cameras were worn by the officer at the time? And at a very high level, is within the body camera policy, do we have anywhere that specifies how it will be used and released to the media and public, or if that is something that is determined by ACERT throughout their investigation?
Yeah, so this is a situation where, again, with the CPS not leading the investigation there, this flows to ACERT. So this is evidence there. So our patrol officers there do have body worn video. So the answer to whether or not they had it is yes. In this case, that video is collected by ACERT, all of that evidence, and they then use that for the purposes of their review. And then if down the road, if it's needed for court purposes, it's released in that forum. If it's not needed for court purposes down the line, there could be opportunities for it to be released. I can tell you in the past, I can't think of a situation where it's been released in the past, but sometimes, as you can appreciate, there's ongoing civil litigation, there's fatality inquiries, there's a number of processes that flow along. The body worn video also can be available at the appropriate time, or portions of it can be available through FOIP itself. So that's another way that people can obtain it. But certainly right now, that's in the hands of ACERT for the purposes of the criminal investigation, and it will certainly remain that way.
Okay, and this is the last one from me before I graciously hand it off to my other commissioners who have let me do this. It's more just on resources available to the officers, to the families, and then to the community. And I really just want to make sure that we ended on something where, what are the resources that are available to kind of all the parties involved, the officers, the family of the deceased, and the community?
Going to turn you over to Stacey Ferland. So Stacey's here today, actually sitting in for Deputy Gill, who's absent. And of course, she's the executive director of that program area. So she is probably more first to speak on it than anybody else in the room.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. So in terms of resources and supports that are available to officers that are involved in critical incidents and traumatic events such as this one, we have a very robust system in place. So immediately following a officer-involved shooting, myself and the peer support coordinator and the clinical director of psychological therapy section are notified. And then usually within about an hour of that incident, we will attend both the district office of the subject officers, and then we'll also head to headquarters to see the witness officers. So our process with all of this is initially to screen the initial trauma response in those officers there and then. Those officers that are involved in the officer-involved shooting are put on administrative leave, and some of that is in relation to ensuring that we're looking after their health and safety, and we're giving them all the resources available. We offer health checks, usually within 3 to 5 days, immediately following those critical incidents. And we also offer debriefs, and those debriefs are offered to the members that are directly involved, officers that are indirectly involved, as well as to the service as a whole who may feel that this particular event or something like this has actually triggered previous incidents that they've been exposed to. So we do all of that. We also offer debriefs to the officers' families that may be impacted from this incident. And then we start to prepare our members through the reintegration program. So they're clinically screened and cleared to enter into the reintegration program. As far as the family members of individuals and the community, many of those supports are obviously provided through victim assistance.
I would just add, Stacey, that again, because of these, it ends up being ACERT establishes a family liaison contact. And so they can look at what may be needed as well. In some cases, there's natural supports are sufficient, and in other cases, that's not the case. So.
Okay, thank you. Honestly, thank you everybody for answering all of my questions. For the most part, the overall goal of what the direction of these questions were really to have a serious kind of like high level conversation on some of these structural issues that just exist. Like, it's not a matter of any one particular organization. It's very clear that there are supports that are needed on a system-wide basis to really ensure and grow the ability to respond to people in crisis. And as the CPS are a part of that system of care, that we need to help support and expand. There are questions that will come up down the line throughout this investigation, especially as we are able to be very much more specific in the circumstances surrounding this particular event once the investigation is complete or as we're going through it. But nonetheless, I do want to say that I am grateful for the willingness of everybody to answer these questions in front of a lot of people. I know it's not easy considering how the close proximity to what has happened. It's only been a couple of days. So I really want to say thank you there, and thank you to the rest of the commission for allowing me to add this agenda item, and I look forward to hearing your questions as well too. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Walcott. There are two other commissioners with questions, and so I will ask Commissioner Campbell if you would like to put yours forward.
Thank you very much, Chair. I have 3 questions and then 1 clarification. Chief Neufeld, with respect to the thin blue line, I would heartily dismiss the idea that the thin blue line insignia is an activist issue. This is something that, as a commissioner, I raised in March of 2021 with this commission and with the service. It is a significant issue of great need, for which both the service and the commission are bound to address with urgency and with responsibility. I know that Association President John Orr is on the call, and I know that he's taken great time to correct or attempt to correct my statements on social media with respect to the thin blue line. They didn't need correction. The question that Councillor Walcott and Commissioner Walcott raised was, there is a perception that officers may have been wearing thin blue line patches at the incident. And the issue is, how should a community view that? As a Black woman, I know that I would be left feeling both unsafe and unserved if the officer who attends the shooting of a member of my community is wearing an insignia that is a direct counter to the Black community and the Black Lives Matter movement. That is the intent and the heart of that question and the issue. That is the issue that we need to address. We need to name it. For my first question, it really relates to the use of the canine unit as a de-escalation tool. For centuries, Europeans and Canadians have used police dogs as a tool for racial terror and conquest. European colonists and slave hunters initiated that system of racist violence that's still reflected in modern canine units today. Canine unit handlers use the dogs for drug searches, bomb sniffing, and apprehending suspects in a non-fatal way. Research has often failed to explain why the dogs are trained for maximum aggression, why the bites from canine units are far more lethal than for those of house pets, and why non-white suspects constitute the largest percentage of those suffering from police dog bites. Anti-Black canine terror follows a long tradition of ritualistic violence intended to intimidate, suppress, and marginalize Black people. So, in the police-involved shooting on February 19th, was it appropriate to use a canine unit who is trained to attack as a de-escalation tool with a member of a racialized community, given this understanding of our history and our collective, and when I say our, I mean the Commission and CPS's collective use of an anti-racist lens?
Respect, Commissioner Campbell, that's a question for the ACERT investigation. I can't answer that.
Thank you. My second question is about history as well. In your opinion and perspective and knowledge base and experience, how does this case compare to the case of the late Abdirahman Abdi in Ottawa?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I have to tell you that I don't know the specifics of the case in Ottawa. I think that goes back a number of years now. The the specifics of that particular case. So I don't know how those two compare. So I'd prefer not to even speak to it.
Thank you, Chief. And my last question. So the timing of this incident, and tragic as it is, occurred over a similar time frame as we saw the demonstrations in Ottawa. So my question is one more just as a regular citizen, and I recognize that I'm not a regular citizen, but as a regular citizen watching all the various television feeds, how is it that we saw in Ottawa for 3 weeks people who outnumbered the police, who openly assaulted others, who were armed, unmasked, had weapons, both visible and concealed, and police, including members of CPS, thankfully, were able to bring the demonstration to conclusion without the discharge of a service weapon? How do we explain to the public how that approach was used to de-escalate with the Ottawa blockaders and appeared not to be used with the late Mr. Tuel?
That's another very hard question, and I think the situations are quite different. Are you aware, you talked about open carrying of weapons and having weapons in Ottawa. Are you aware in Ottawa of any individual charging towards the police officers in Ottawa with a knife?
I do not specifically know of individuals who charged towards police with a knife in the Ottawa demonstration. I cannot name a single individual, not in my experience and in my observation. Sorry, Chief.
I guess just in terms of comparison then, you know, the operation on the ground in Ottawa took a number of days, I think, to resolve. And so through that, there were a number of interactions between police agencies from across this country and individuals. And so when you talk about the nature of those interactions and the de-escalation that occurred, and again, as I talked about, the subject factors, the officer factors, the environmental factors in all of those, there appears to be a range of different interactions with a range of different outcomes. And again, those are influenced not only by what the police do in the situation, they're also influenced by what the other individuals involved do, and also the situational factors. And I think that, you know, if I think about the number of interactions our police officers had in Calgary over the course of, say, 72 hours, I can tell you that there would have been a range of quality of interactions and a range of outcomes, you know, similarly. I'm having a hard time trying to equate, and honestly, we keep talking about this particular situation with Mr. Tuel, and out of respect, I don't even know why we try to compare Ottawa to this situation. It's a tragedy. I think we need to look at this one for what it is and learn what we can from it. I don't know the utility in trying to somehow shoehorn this situation into the Ottawa context.
Chief, with all due respect, it's simply because it was happening at the same time. And it's, as a member of the public and in my citizen oversight responsibility, it is challenging for the public to see that situation happening in Ottawa where there were weapons. And absolutely, I take complete correction on that. I cannot personally name a single individual who had a knife charging at police. No, I'm not that skilled. I apologize. But to watch that, and then to watch a situation with one man and a number of police, and see Ottawa with a number of police and hundreds of people, it is difficult to understand. And this is why I'm asking. It's really that they were happening at the same time. And as a community member, you cannot help but draw parallels. And so it's not a futility. It's not an exercise of futility, Chief. It is an exercise of understanding and seeking to as Commissioner Walcott said, put it in the perspective that a regular Calgarian can understand and why the two situations cannot be compared.
So maybe I will take that, and I think it's an interesting point of conversation. I very much appreciate that, and perhaps that's one that will perhaps go forward as we understand more about the certain investigation and other things. But for now, a good observation.
Thank you very much, Chair.
And we'll thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Campbell. Commissioner Sang.
Thanks, Chair. Chief, I have two follow-up questions from Councilor Walcott's questions. First one is about the ACERT timeline. So generally it's 18 to 24 months. But based on the public information on ACERT website, it seems like that is relatively a small portion of what ACERT investigate about. Does this case like this will, how to say, expedite the investigation or like give a faster investigation results?
So I know I've spoken to the new executive director in ACERT, and he realizes this is a significant event for our community. So he's committed toward trying to expedite this, but I don't think the issue, Commissioner Zhang, is solely on, how many of these particular investigations they do. I think it's around backlog. So I think on the one hand, they're trying to clear a backlog of investigations, some of which are older, obviously, and you can appreciate that as much as we want justice and answers as quickly as we can for our community, Mr. Tuel's family, our police officers, everybody involved, there's people from previous critical incidents that want the same, and that's reasonable also. So as I say, I do know that this is high on the radar of the provincial government. They're well aware, and I think there are some actions being taken to try to speed this up. So I think all of us are in the same boat when we say we're hopeful that that can happen, because I think it serves no one when it takes an extraordinary period of time to get answers in relation to these.
Thanks. My second follow-up question is about first aid training for the officers. I think there's a word I just heard is duty of care policy. So is that a CPS policy or is more generic policing standard policy across all the organizations?
No, that's a CPS policy. That is that's been an upgrade, obviously. That policy, has that come to CPC yet, Joe, or is it coming? I think yes.
Thank you, Commissioner. We presented 2 weeks ago, I think, at GMP, and it's just about rolling out in the service by the end of this week or by Monday.
Okay, so it's still not enforceable yet for the service.
No, it hasn't been published with the service as of yet. It's imminent.
Okay. Okay, thanks. That's all my questions. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Zhang. Commissioner Siddiqui, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Chief, you had briefly touched on this, but can you please elaborate who you've met with in terms of the community, and did you meet with the South Sudanese Community Association and sit down and have a conversation with them at this point?
Let me say this. I'd like to take this question offline, and I say that because some of the conversations that we've had with members of the community, there are some sensitivities within the community around meeting with police. So recognizing this is a public forum, happy to take it into the closed if you like, but that would be my preference if you're okay with that.
Sure, Chief, that's fine. The other question I had was regarding the Anti-Racism Action Committee. You have the external one. Will there be a meeting of that group put together quickly to debrief regarding this and talk about some of the cultural pieces that occurred here and to get information from them as well as brief them? Because I'm sure some of them are quite shocked at this as well.
Yes, a great question. Thank you. So they have been briefed. We've been in communication with them, obviously, since the incident occurred, and the meeting that you talk about is scheduled for tomorrow.
Perfect. Thanks, Chief.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Commissioner Siddiqui. Commissioner North Pagan, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks so much, And Chief, I was able to listen to your statement out to the media, and thank you for giving that statement at such a quick pace so we can analyze the situation. What I have to comment to is, I was at that front line. I was a health worker. I work at the front line. So I do understand that this is the end of the line when CPS takes this. So we have to, zoom out and look at the bigger picture and where we are slipping through the gaps as a community. There is a community safety investment framework that we planted in order to address things like this. So the focus has to include community. Indigenous people, we have restorative justice. So folks don't go along this line and end up at that final stage of this tragedy. These are the things that we have to start building into our law enforcement frameworks when it comes to mental health supports. These are the things that we use in restorative justice, but also to that de-escalation, that cultural relevancy in that de-escalation. This is where these things come into play with the mental health supports. And I'm gonna keep pushing this as we move along further, because I've seen what restorative justice can do. But we have to be able to look at this as a full picture, because CPS is the end of the line when it comes to these types of calls. I know this from experience, and I know this as an ex-EMS worker, that we need to keep people out of those gaps within the community. So this is a bigger analysis than just de-escalation. And we have to look at the frameworks. We have to take a step back and see how we're failing these individuals as a community. And I'm telling you, I've seen this through restorative justice, and that's all I wanted to comment on.
Thank you very much, Commissioner North Pagan. And I think that that's a very good reminder that as much as we need to understand this particular incident and deal with it, it does also reflect on the other work that has only just barely been started. Late to the game perhaps, but it has been started. We need to really focus on what is the larger picture that we're looking at to try and support people in our community. So thank you very much for those comments.
If I could just add quickly, Chair, I think Commissioner North Pagan's question is a good one, but again, with the greatest of respect, I guess I would ask and this is rhetorical, but what gaps are we seeing right now in relation to this situation? Because I feel like there's been a lot of commentary on this prior to us understanding the issues. So in our connections with the community, it's very important that we look at gaps, but we've certainly heard from folks that they're not ready yet. We've heard from some people they want to have discussions around specifics around this, but in terms of where the gaps are in this situation, we're looking forward to actually moving at the speed of community on this and taking lead as to what needs to be done. But I guess it just sort of takes me a little bit aback that there's so many people that have it figured out already. Before the investigation, I think if anybody should have it figured out, I think it's probably community understanding the background of this. And so we're waiting to hear that. And maybe some other folks that have taken strong stances on this maybe already have that. I don't know. And if they do, then I think that's good, but we don't. And I think, Commissioner Walcott, you made a good point about the fact that this is pretty raw for everybody. Still, this is a matter of days into this. And so I do believe we're going to get there, but I guess I'm just a bit surprised at all the people that have the solutions figured out already. And they've applying solutions to problems that I'm not sure we understand. I know we don't just yet. We don't have the information. And that's why we're really relying on the process and the investigation and our own internal reviews there to get to that. So I just think we've just got to be a little cautious about solving a problem before we understand it.
Did you have a follow-up comment, Commissioner North Pagan?
Yes, Chief, I wasn't pointing the finger at saying that CPS has all these gaps. It's the community in whole as to how these end up in the policing as the end result. Because I do know as a frontline worker that when you are at your ends of your resources, you have to make that call to the police service to come in. And I'm pushed back until that is actually, retained. So this is not just a policing issue. This is an entire community issue. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Thank you, Marilyn. I couldn't agree more with that.
And I would, just to make sure my comments were clear as well, is that, yes, this is a particular situation we need to deal with, but there is the other work we have to do with the rest of the community and all of the whole network, the system. So it's not about just the CPS for sure. Commissioner Walcott, you have a question.
Sorry, it's really just a follow-up comment to the chief's point. I am taken aback by that comment, Chief, that people haven't figured out. It's this is not a singular situation that we've seen before. I should say this isn't new. This isn't a one-off moment in time, in history, in the landscape of Canadian society, let alone the landscape of the Calgary Police. A few years ago, a lethal force review was done. I'm going to ask these questions later in the in-camera session, but even there, it was noticed that 20 of the 32, I think my memory serves, lethal uses of force by the police in a 10-year period, 20 of them were either in two separate categories, and one was addictions, the other was mental health. When you look at the landscape of systemic failures of even the last 2 years, how many times do we bring up the conversation on anti-racism? How many times do we bring up the name George Floyd? This in itself is an isolated situation that we do not know the answer to yet. But the gaps that lead to this are the subject of deep analysis that we have all been a part of every time our anti-racism committee comes together, every time a study is done. No one can really point to the solution of this issue. However, it is really easy to point out to the familiarity of how this incident rhymes with so many other ones that we've seen around the world, that speaks to Commissioner Pagan North's point of systemic issues in policing as a whole. So I understand the sensitivity of this particular shooting, but I think it's very significant we acknowledge that the structures of policing have always lended themselves to gaps when it comes to mental health supports. Regardless of whether or not you knew that, that is something that we have all acknowledged historically, we've acknowledged presently, and we've acknowledged within the community, and then we've acknowledged internally as part of our institution as CPC and as CPS. So I do want to caution that what sometimes might feel like an attack is actually just an acknowledgement of flaws in a system that was designed to deal with issues that you are not supposed to deal with, right? These are not supposed to be in your table. This is when we've had this conversation many times, that these things are not supposed to rest on your shoulders. The CPS, as Commissioner Pagan North commented on, is the last line of like when you've gotten to the end of supports, when it gets to that scenario. Every stop along the way before it gets there has flaws, and every stop has also had solutions that have been put forward over the years. And I don't think anyone can confidently say that over the years of all the studies done and all the research and all the recommendations to address the gaps in every single system that has systemic issues has been utilized and addressed. I don't think the CPS could say that. I know that I, as a City of Calgary councillor, I can say that we have not done so. I can say that AHS has not done so. So I do want to caution and really like speak to that idea that there are gaps that have been clear outside of this particular situation in isolation, that had they been addressed in the other ones, it is a fair assumption to suggest that it is possible that a different outcome could have been a result of the interaction we saw over the weekend. And sorry, I felt really, I felt like that had to be said to set the tone for what this discussion is supposed to be about.
No, I acknowledge what you're saying, and I think the sensitivity is around, it's like high beams, low beams. And on the low beam, we're looking and we're talking about this situation right now, and it is very raw for the community, and it's raw for us. I acknowledge what you're saying, and it is a community response. And I think it's just frustrating. And I know we've all talked about the fact that, we did make the commitments that we talked about in terms of anti-racism and finding ways to address gaps in the crisis response system. And that's really important work to us. And so it feels some days like we're the ones doing the lifting. And all of a sudden, when there's an incident that happens, then it feels like the blame is on the police. And so it's a systems issue. Again, we've seen it in previous, as you've said, in previous incidents there around the province and around the country where there's been fatality inquiries, where the systemic issues have been addressed and they have been highlighted brightly. And there has to be opportunities to keep people out of crisis so that these things don't have to get dealt with on the corner of 17th Ave and 41st Street Southeast, because that's a bad place to deal with them.
Thank you very much, Chief. And I would like to thank everyone for their comments and conversation around this item. It is large. It's both systemic and specific, and it is raw right now. And it also highlights the work that we're meant to be here to do and to continue the discussions and the conversations. So, well, thank you for all of that. And I would like to move on. Commissioner Campbell, one last comment, perhaps.
Thank you very much, Chair. Chief, I wanted to address your comment about it seems like we're doing all the lifting. The work on anti-racism is hard, and no one there. I will always give CPS credit for your historic statement in September of 2020, acknowledging systemic racism. No matter what anybody says, that was historic. And you know that in any time I'm speaking about the work that happens here in Calgary, I speak about the historic nature of that. And I applaud you for the courage to do it after that time. But the work on anti-racism is a continuous challenge. It is pushing a lead ball uphill like Atlas forever. We are the work that we are doing with the anti-racism committees, that's first level. The challenges that we've raised in this case, as raw and as particular and as detailed as they are, and as hostile as it seems and attacking as it seems, it is now the conversation to raise it to the second level. And that's dealing with our training and thinking about culturally appropriate de-escalation tools and the anti-racism lens that gets applied to those tools. And then it'll be third level. And we're going to push that lead ball up the hill like Atlas once more. But do not fear, we're here with you. And that statement was made jointly. And we're walking that road with you. So know that my hostility is passion, and it's also help. And if I know anything about energy, and I do, that formula works.
Thank you, Commissioner Campbell. With that, I will put this item aside for the time being, and I'd like to move on to the other reports that are planned for today. There are a number of them. I'd like to deal with or bring forward pharmacy and cannabis store robberies. Yes, sorry, my light's going down here. So there's a report, and then we'll have questions, and then we'll take the other three reports that will come after that. So Chief, if I can turn it back over to you for this second report. And thank you again for all of your input to the first item that was brought forward.
Thanks very much. We appreciate the discussion. It's an important discussion, so certainly good. I'd like to introduce Acting Deputy Chief Ryan Aliff. So Ryan's here today representing the Bureau of Investigative Support for Deputy Chief Cook, and he's going to give us a presentation on a series of pharmacy and cannabis store robberies that have been occurring here in our city and what we're doing about it. Over to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Chief, and good evening, Chair and Commission members and members of the community. This is brought forward this topic, Operation Remedies, so that we could bring public awareness to promote public safety around the pharmacy store robberies and the cannabis robberies that were happening primarily in 2021 and at the start of this year. We want to highlight the impact we have on officer safety as well and demonstrate the good work that our officers are doing to resolve these as they work through them. So just a bit of a background. This presentation will delve into Operation Remedy, but first we'll look at some of the background and why Remedy came to be and the precursor operations that led to Remedy, specifically Beehive and Elixir. We will then look at the current status of Remedy. We'll provide some of the statistics on the number of files, number of charges, and the offenders we are working with, what kind of efforts go into investigating a pharmacy robbery from the initial call until charges are laid, and then further discuss some of the investigative challenges we've experienced with these files. Looking at offender management is always essential when attempting to address or prevent continuation of occurrences. And as such, we will discuss how that has occurred and what efforts have been made to mitigate occurrences as well. We'll then go into how we have worked with partners individually, the efforts that have been made in prevention, and finally, we will discuss the amount of resources from across the service that are put into these incidents. In November of 2018, there was an increase in robberies. These robberies targeted mostly electronic stores and box stores. So think of stores like Rogers or TELUS or larger stores like Best Buy or Walmart. As a result, Operation Beehive began. These offenses began as smash and grab offenses that were generally crimes of opportunity and grew in sophistication and degrees of violence. Large groups of offenders would attend and swarm the store. So although we were focusing on Remedy, just to give you an example, you would see in some cases 4 to 7 offenders run into a store, dealing with employees, taking merchandise all at the same time, very overwhelming for the owners of the store and the employees. As a result of the operation, 37 offenders were identified, 329 criminal code charges were laid, and 15 warrants were executed. Over $100,000 of stolen property was recovered. In the summer of 2019, 2 males involved in the offenses were deported as a result of criminal action, which caused some significant fear in the community and a reduction in the offenses. Due to the reduction of the offenses as a result of arrests, warrants, and deportations, Operation Beehive was concluded in May of 2020. Shortly thereafter, in June of 2020, an increase in pharmacy robberies was seen with a similar MO of a takeover style. So a takeover style is a little different than swarming, but same principles. Offenders will rush in, they will immediately grab hold of employees. Often cases, they'll secure the door, they'll take charge of the entire pharmacy or cannabis store or convenience store, often with overwhelming and dynamic force. The offenders within these pharmacy robberies are seen to be targeting Cotradin, which is codeine cough syrup. A likely reason for the appearance of pharmacy robberies was a change in legislation. So in July of 2020, a 2-part prescription form was required in order to get this. In total, 51 pharmacy robberies were investigated, 14 offenders were identified, and 44 criminal charges were laid. With temporary resources and no pharmacy robberies between March 19th and May 13th, the operation was collapsed. While the operation is no longer active, work continues to be done on the 51 files that were taken on in Operation Elixir, and the most recent charges were laid in January of this year. We'll talk about some of the delays further on in investigative challenges, but I will say a crossover, some of the offenders between Beehive and Elixir are occurring in Operation Remedy. So in July of 2021, an increase was seen once more in the number of pharmacy robberies. These offenses stayed consistent in the MO, but increased in levels of violence. And so before we were seeing offenders rush in and they might have batons, bear spray, in some cases they might have a knife. We were seeing more and more firearms in the robberies, that started in July of 2021, and an increase in assaultive behavior. Generally, these offenses see 2 to 5 offenders entering a store and using weapons, threats, or violence to get the pharmacist to open the safe. In 90% of the files looked at by Operation Remedy investigators, violence was used or threatened. So that's 53 of 59 files. So far, 33 individuals have been identified as suspects or offenders. 316 criminal code charges have been laid, and 23 warrants have been executed, with an additional 19 warrants pending. These warrants include everything from vehicular tracker warrants, production orders, to search warrants and DNA warrants. Operation Remedy has taken on the investigation of 59 pharmacy robberies, along with upwards of 30 additional spin-off files. So spin-off file is a file that you're dealing with as an investigator. You're dealing with an initial robbery, and through the course of your investigation, you realize that one of the suspects may be related to another crime. So some of those spin-off files would have included cannabis store robberies, convenience store robberies, carjackings, stolen vehicles, thefts, drug trafficking, and more. All of these files were taken on by the task force due to the crossover in offenders, MO, vehicles, etc. Remedy is ongoing, and work continues to identify and charge further offenders. So if it works, which we'll figure out how to work it if I can't make it work right off the bat, we put together CCTV of 4 separate pharmacy robberies. Actually, 3 are pharmacies and 1's a convenience store. We've done this so that we can demonstrate to everybody here the violence and impact on the community that these robberies are having, and also so that we can help explain how we could easily draw a line between when these offenses are happening and if a police response is quick enough, how we could have a very troubling encounter between offenders and the police if found committing. So the video depicts high risk presented to officers, high level of violence. The offenders are going to have firearms. There's no sound. So in some cases, I'll try to narrate just so you can see some of the key things. There's lots of things to look at. Before I press play, I'll tell you in the first robbery, or in the first pharmacy robbery, you're going to see offenders. One will have a handgun. It will be pointed at a victim. The offender's finger is on the trigger, and he uses that gun to strike the victim, which is very troubling because obviously the firearm could go off at any time. And there's lots of assaultive behavior. In one of the other clips, you're going to see, and these victims in all of these robberies are compliant. They're doing everything that these offenders are asking them to do, and they're still assaulted and victims of violence. You're going to see one of the offenders will be put in a back room and bear sprayed as well. So I'll start the video now, and if there's any questions afterwards, we can address them. Just know that before I start, every single one of these victims was offered victim assistance resources as a result of our first responders in patrol. Give me a second. I apologize. We are muted or not?
Unmuted now.
Okay. I was actually just going to narrate it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So you can see this is where they lead the victim into the back room, and it's one of the offenders here. You can see assaulting them, and then bear sprays the victim. So So you'll notice the offenders in all of these are hoodies, gloves, masks. Very hard to identify. In each of these instances, these offenders are all under 18 years old. This is just a terrible experience for the pharmacy owners and the you're going to see in the next one, which is a convenience store, just to prepare you for it. They forcefully tear off his headdress. That's very dangerous. Gun to the face of the victim. So they've torn off his headdress there, which is incredibly impactful. Every single one of these victims is doing everything they can to comply with the demands of these offenders. Okay. So after the video you just viewed, it can be better understood how a pharmacy robbery begins and what results in a call to police. Police involvement begins after either a call from the pharmacy itself, after the offenders have fled, or from an alarm company if the victims were able to set off an alarm. A minimum of 1 2-member unit attends the scene and begins containing the area, conducting checks and speaking to witnesses. So we have an incident command framework that's part of our response, and it, in often cases, something like this, it's not going to be 1 2-man unit. It'll be more than that. We will look at containing and isolating and looking at ways to stabilize the scene so that our members can get in there safely. Additional units are almost always requested to provide containment, and resources from HAWK, canine surveillance, TAC, etc., are often requested dependent upon the specific call itself. The RTOC sends officers out on scene with a patrol checklist created by the Operation Remedy investigators, so that the first units on scene can begin collecting vital information. Following the initial call, the robbery unit staff sergeant is called and advised of the situation and circumstances. The staff sergeant then will call a minimum of 2 detectives who will attend the scene. These detectives are often being called out from home on their days off or during an evening following their regular scheduled shift. The detectives will usually spend 4 to 6 hours at the scene for the initial report. They begin canvassing for CCTV, taking witness statements and collecting evidence. If there's anything left at the scene or anything that may have fingerprints or DNA transfer, the forensic crime scenes unit is also called. If there are arrests made or vehicles recovered following a pharmacy robbery, more members of the robbery team are required. A robbery investigation is never completed on the day it occurs. In the days and weeks following, detectives continue to work to collect and analyze CCTV. This process can take hours and entails making detailed notes of everything seen in the video and comparing it to other incidents. In the weeks and months following the robbery, detectives continue to work to compare and analyze DNA, fingerprints, and other evidence left behind. Sometimes this means conducting search warrants, looking for cast-off DNA, writing production orders, and other work that looks to find and arrest the offenders. Challenges are often faced in the delays that the detectives will experience at this stage of the investigation, which brings us to some of our challenges. Several challenges have been experienced when investigating these files, but perhaps the most obvious is the sheer volume of the offenses themselves. Detectives are stretched thin, and in attempting to address all the components and complete an investigation, they are often challenged to prevent further offenses from occurring. So identification challenges. You saw these in the video. Mask mandates have increased challenges in identifying offenders. So you'll see them, they're wearing masks, they have hoodies, they're wearing gloves, they're covered from head to toe. And often these things also make it difficult to have that transfer of evidence or fingerprints or DNA exchange from the scene. Almost all of the identified offenders have similar physical attributes, and they are able to frequently swap clothing or pieces of clothing, making it difficult to connect offenders to offenses, even if an individual is located in the area shortly after an offense and matches the description in clothing. The offenders are mainly use, which poses additional challenges in what we do. Since their DNA won't be on file, or their fingerprints, or often their photographs, making it difficult to link them to offenses. It is clear that these offenders are aware of what they're doing and how to conduct the offenses to minimize the risk of being caught. They are aware of store policies and have been confirmed to case businesses prior to offending. In some cases, they've been known to call the pharmacy first to make sure the product they are looking for is there at that location. They also know how to target businesses that do not utilize time delay safes. Or if they do, they are generally ones that are set to a shorter time, so 5 minutes or less, and are aware of how long they have to flee the location. The offenders also hit businesses with poor or no CCTV, although that's not the case in the ones we saw, or will destroy the CCTV present to minimize the risk of being caught. There are several groups of these offenders, and they are highly fluid and always evolving. They offend across the city, and the members of the groups seem to change day by day. It is unknown if this is based on whoever is available to participate in a particular offense on a given day, or if it's an attempt to not be caught, or if it's something else entirely. The offenders appear to be coached to the pharmacy robberies. The consistency between the offenses shows that there is likely pre-planning that goes into the offense. So in two of the videos, you'll see they have very similar gloves, they have very similar hoodies, two different offenses themselves, obviously linked. Investigators have experienced delays across these investigations that is only exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So resourcing issues. If an officer writes a production order on a device, a phone number or social media account, there is generally a 30-day minimum for a turnaround. Officers are also seeing delays in DNA orders, receiving hits back with many offenders not yet in the DNA databases. Those delays become even longer. Further issues are seen in DNA when oftentimes there's a mix of several profiles in a sample and the RCMP is unable to identify a profile. So when they switch clothes, you get mixed samples. Although a private lab can often find information from these samples, further delays and costs are incurred. While investigating the offenses themselves is vital, equally as important is managing the offenders so they are unable to commit the same offense again. Offenders are being managed by ongoing monitoring, regular curfew checks with the assistance of patrol and GST, and we have engaged with the probation and judicial systems to ensure that when they are released, these offenders receive conditions that are enforceable, such as curfew. The Organized Retail Crime Unit, which is part of the overall offender management unit, has been engaged and will begin regularly monitoring some of the most serious offenders. The goal of this ongoing monitoring is in hopes of suppressing the incidents and aims to reduce rates of recidivism. In conjunction with suppression, we also have been working to try to intervene, especially with some of the younger offenders that have just begun to offend. With the assistance of the Youth at Risk Development Program, school resource officers, community resource officers, our diversity unit, and crime prevention, we've begun to be able to speak to some of these youths to begin to understand why they are offending, and as such have been working to attempt to aid in putting programs into place. This is the information that will be discussed further by Staff Sergeant McQueen in this presentation. Significant work has been done to work with counterparts and partners across the province in order to work together to begin to mitigate or stop these offenses. The Crime Prevention Unit, so that's made up specifically of Acting Detective Anthony Thompson, has taken a pivotal role in working with partners and has become a subject matter expert in working to prevent these offenses. As Edmonton and some smaller RCMP communities saw a similar spike in pharmacy robberies, a provincial task force involving CPS, EPS, RCMP, and the Alberta College of Pharmacies, as well as the Alberta Pharmacists Association, was created to focus on these offenses and to share information. That fed into a committee on prevention and led to the Alberta College of Pharmacists passing a mandate for all pharmacies to have time release safes. This mandate will be in effect in July of 2022. A significant amount of education has been provided to both the Alberta College of Pharmacists and the Alberta Pharmacists Association, including a bi-weekly crime prevention and awareness tips in their publication called The Pill, which is distributed province-wide, and a joint webinar alongside EPS, which was viewed by over 800 pharmacists across the province. The work done specifically by Acting Detective Thompson has been recognized across the nation, with police services in both Abbotsford and Winnipeg reaching out and consulting him on the crime prevention work done at the pharmacies. A crime prevention risk assessment tool, CPRAT, was created on the basis of crime prevention through environmental design, short form CPTED, and provided to all community resource officers throughout the city so they are able to follow up using a checklist to provide information and advice to pharmacies on their weak spots and how they could target, harden, or make themselves a less likely victim. The first pharmacies that were assessed with the CPRAT tool were those that had been hit more than once. The pharmacies that employed the information and made the changes recommended experienced 0 robberies following that implementation. A number of media releases have been conducted advising the public of what is occurring and requesting individuals be aware of their surroundings and to call in if they see something suspicious. This has aided in recovering vehicles or other evidence fairly quickly. So when we let the public know what we're looking for, we're getting great assistance from the people in the community and we greatly appreciate it. Ongoing communication and collaboration has occurred with the pharmacies and the Alberta Pharmacists Association. Further to that, a WhatsApp group has been created and is monitored by Acting Detective Thompson, where over 300 pharmacists are actively involved and will often advise in real time of incidents of casing, suspicious activity, or common concerns that may not require a 911 call. This ongoing engagement has been significant and has aided detectives in several incidents. This last slide is pretty straightforward. We wanted to demonstrate all the resources that our service specifically are putting into this. You can't see all of them. I couldn't fit them all on the slide, but the one that I had forgotten to put on here or just couldn't fit on is the RTFC, which is our real-time information center, which coordinates the majority of these resources. So in short, it takes a lot to tackle this 1030 through Operation Remedy, and we wanted to make sure we gave credit where credit was due. With that, I know it was a lot and I appreciate everybody's patience. Can answer any questions if there are
some. Commissioner Siddiqui.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Acting Deputy Chief. I had a question. Actually, I'm quite saddened and shocked to learn that most of these are youth under the age of 18. I find that absolutely horrific. Can you comment a little bit more on that or elaborate in terms of what you're doing with the youth partners you have, so Mast, Yard, etc., or talking to schools? What is the work being done, and has there been any strong coordination in finding out who these youth are and any intervention that's been done?
So we can, and it's part of
Not on yet.
the in-camera presentation that's going to be put out.
Oh, hang on a second.
Killing me here.
Yes, so the answer is yes. That will be presented by Staff Sergeant McQueen in the closed. And we'll get into details specifically around that just in the interest of time, if you're good at that, Commissioner.
I'm fine with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Commissioner Zhang.
Thanks, Chair. Just a title of the presentation is Pharmacy and Cannabis Store Robberies. Is there another presentation about cannabis store robberies, or just something else happened that is only pharmacy today?
Commissioner Zhang, that's, I'm not only having trouble with the camera, but also with the agenda items. That was, it was labeled Pharmacy and Cannabis Store Robberies at my request. Although this presentation focuses on pharmacies, we're seeing similar trends in cannabis store robberies, which we'll discuss in the closed session as well.
Okay, thank you. Back to the Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Campbell.
Thanks very much, Chair. Thank you for that presentation. And I appreciate the full scope of work and your comments at the end that almost every department touched Operation Remedy, and thank you for that. So thank you for that support. I noted that a number of the pharmacists in the videos happen to be racialized and from a racialized community. Is that just a coincidence because those are the videos that you elected to use, or is that a trend among the pharmacy robberies? And are you also seeing that replicated in the cannabis store robberies? And then with respect to the youth, my thinking, and it's an inference, and I don't know if it's correct at this point, is that there's many are able to actually work at pharmacies at a younger age. You can't necessarily work at a cannabis store, but is there a potential link between the age of part-time employees and being youth and these particular robberies, and because of their knowledge?
Thank you for the question. There is no link between the offenders and previous employees that have yet been found. And as for the ethnicity of the pharmacists, it was simply the videos we chose. So there's no higher frequency than that. That's all.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Seeing no further questions, I much appreciate that, and just indication of the ongoing continual work in the city. I'd like to then move on to the next items on the agenda. There's 3 reports: the pandemic impacts, anti-racism action plan update, and the crime update. And so I'll ask if you can present all 3 reports, and if commissioners can hold their questions until we've heard all 3 reports, and then go to questions. Turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Chair. Consider it done. We'll move to 5.2 then, which is pandemic impacts. We'll actually start with Stacey Ferland, who's in on the HR side, and then she'll pass it over to Deputy Tofik, who will speak to the operational side. Stacey, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Chief. Like it's already been mentioned, I'm Stacey Ferland. I'm the Executive Director for Wellness and Resiliency, and this week I'm covering for Deputy Chief Raj Gill. I'll be representing the Bureau this afternoon and giving a very brief high-level update on the pandemic impacts to this Bureau specifically. So the Bureau of People and Organizational Development is undertaking significant initiatives as outlined in the annual policing plan to modernize human resources, advance training improvements, and supporting members' wellness and resiliency. The pandemic has brought challenges to all these areas and divisions. Despite these challenges, the service has pivoted and remained agile to ensure progress on the initiatives and address COVID-19 policies and health restrictions. I also want to point out at this point that during the pandemic, we've hired Andrea Urquhart as our Executive Director and Patrick Mack as our Director of Human Resources. So right in the middle of the pandemic, they've come on board. They've been pivoting resources and managing the vaccine mandate, as brand new employees, which is a huge, huge success to the service. We're also seeing an ongoing decline in our positive 19 cases within the service, and things are starting to stabilize. I'm just going to walk us through kind of some specific areas within the Bureau. So in relation to the provincial health restrictions and the return to the office plan. So given the recent significant changes in the provincial public health restrictions, the service has developed a plan for return to the office for those employees who have been working remotely. A plan for safe return to the office with protocols in place for April 4th, 2022 is to protect employees and members of the public. We're developing a hybrid policy that allows eligible positions to work up to 50% of their time remotely. And we're collaborating with the City of Calgary and unions and associations. We're also considering the factors that involve IT equipment and facility. Developing the policy and associated processes has taken up a significant amount of resources within human resources that was previously working on the vaccine mandate, which has impacted the pace of progress for other policy work aligned with the modernization commitments. In terms of member wellness, our Bureau members are working hard to provide support to work areas experiencing the effects of COVID, while also experiencing those same effects as service providers. This is leading to COVID fatigue, as other non-COVID work remains to be prioritized. More specifically, wellness supports have been tangibly impacted by the pandemic. For example, critical incident debriefs, organizational wellness sessions, and training schedules have been reimagined, and some were even paused due to capacity restrictions. Psychotherapy was intermittently delivered virtually due to work from home orders. This paused all trauma treatment for extended periods of time due to the risks involved with delivering this mode of treatment virtually online. This has also impacted members' progression in therapy, and in some cases has led to treatment regression and destabilization. Support for members dealing with Sergeant Hannett's line of duty death was impacted by the pandemic as well, as we saw an increase in requests for services such as support, debriefs, and therapy. The limited capacity for funeral attendance and engagement in memorial activities compounded complicated grief and for many. Events such as the Wellness Expo, the health screening clinics have been cancelled for the last 2 years, which obviously is another impact to our Bureau. In-person courses such as the Working Mind for First Responders was cancelled, while other courses we were able to move online, which because of the reduced participation and capacity. In terms of training, the current COVID restrictions affect both recruit and in-service training due to a limited number of classrooms and training facilities like the driving track and range, which are available to hold a certain amount of personnel. The Chief Crowfoot Learning Centre remains agile in their approach to the training delivery based on the COVID impact within the recruit classes. At times, individuals and whole classes have been taking part in virtual learning from home. To date, this hasn't had a detrimental impact on timelines or training. However, this is constantly being reassessed based on the COVID situation and the learning objectives required. In relation to recruitment, finally, the recruiting and selection unit continues to navigate the challenges that impact outreach and applicant testing scheduling. However, we remain very confident that we can achieve our 2022 goals. Thank you.
Thanks, Stacey, and we'll just pass it directly over to Deputy Tofik.
Thanks, Chief, and thanks, Chair and members of the Commission. The CPS continues to monitor and respond to the impacts of the pandemic from an operational perspective. We need to have our COVID incident management team, or IMT, activated, which includes an element that's focused on related investigations and operational matters. In relation to crime and disorder, overall, throughout the pandemic, we've seen impacts on a number of crime categories, as we've previously reported. I'll be brief around here because I'll cover a bit of that in the crime update, but although those trends have continued, we are seeing some that are moving more toward the 5-year average, so trending up a little bit. This includes break and enters and theft of vehicles. Social disorder for January and year to date are trending in line with the 5-year average. And we are seeing some evidence of that in relation to the LRT lines, which has continued to be an area of focus for us. Non-domestic violence in the latter part of 2021 and early 2022 has shown a slight increase as compared to the 5-year average as well. As reported previously, reported domestic violence has shown a continued reduction. However, the domestic reporting, non-criminal, continues to be increased as compared to the 5-year average. Speaking about demonstrations and protests, as we've seen with the trend over the past 2 years throughout the pandemic, those demonstrations and protests have continued to increase and have required ongoing planning, response, and attention to address the local impacts. Our experience in Calgary is not unique to our jurisdiction and is similar to other major centers in Alberta and across Canada. We continue to address these demonstrations and protests, attempting to work with organizers to maintain peace and public safety. Since our last update, the trend toward convoy-style protests has become prevalent. These have caused some major disruptions across Canada, as everyone's noticed. In early February, in response to the move toward the slow roll convoy protests aimed at disrupting Calgarians, our organization responded proactively, engaging organizers, and worked to prevent disruptions and there was one group that managed to conduct their demonstration in a peaceful manner. Others, however, chose to be non-cooperative and consistently violated traffic legislation. As a result, our traffic members were proactively deployed to those events, and in the course of those events issued a number of tickets. I think there's 80, 30 on site and 50 in the mail for a variety of offenses. Those efforts continue to prevent those types of protests from causing an occupation or other concerns in our city. Last week, the CPS received a request to send that was sent to all major agencies across Canada for support to address the illegal protest in Ottawa. And like most larger police agencies, subsequently provided support by sending a contingent of our public safety unit trained members to assist. Efforts were made to ensure that sufficient capacity remained to address the potential demonstrations and protest activity on a local level. The members who responded were involved in a variety of missions to reestablish a zone in Ottawa as part of the interagency response. I certainly am proud of the way they handled themselves on site there in a professional interagency response, and certainly would like to acknowledge the dedication, commitment, and professionalism of them and their deployment, especially getting this request short notice and had to leave basically within 24 to 48 hours. And as we speak, I believe they are in transit on their way back, so we are looking forward to have them back in the ranks here shortly. Lastly, the CPS continues to participate and collaborate with other stakeholders as part of the provincial Alberta Enforcement Framework for Repeat Offenders Operational Group, and that's the provincial group across sectors. That group has been instrumental around sharing of information and also addressing protests across the province, and certainly has been raised the profile of that work, especially in the last month. So I'll leave it there for this portion of the report.
Okay, thanks, Deputy Tofik. And we'll move to Deputy Chief McClellan, and she'll provide the update on the Anti-Racism Action Plan and Annual Report.
Thanks so much, Chief. Good afternoon, Chair, Commission members, members of the public. Let's give a couple of very brief high-level overviews. We have submitted our first year-end report on addressing systemic racism at the Calgary Police Service. Our anti-racism team has collected 358 international, federal, provincial, municipal, and local anti-racism recommendations. An assessment of each recommendation has been conducted to identify, first of all, what applies to CPS, what work is already underway, and what opportunities or gaps can be addressed by our anti-racism strategy. And we continue to work with our Chief Crowfoot Learning Center to develop and implement anti-racism training, as well as other cultural appropriate training. Both our internal and external anti-racism teams are currently working on our strategy, which will be completed by the end of Q1. We are prioritizing integration of dialogue. We are developing a CPS anti-racism policy. We are prioritizing change management and training, and are ensuring our commitments are resourced, progressed, and reported through our annual policing plan. Our change management strategist was hired on January 31st, and we're in the process of hiring 2 additional consultants to assist with our transformational change and engagement initiatives. We continue to meet with numerous stakeholders and partners to speak at several events. Just a quick update on our Indigenous Relations team. We refer to it as our IRT, and it is up and it has been implemented. As you may recall, the IRT will be the centralized coordination point for all activities related to relationship building and reconciliation with the Indigenous community. Supported by community engagement, immediate objectives of the IRT are continuous revision of the Indigenous roadmap, establishment of member circles within the CPS, an elder circle, and looking at the establishment of exchange programs with tribal police services in Alberta. Recently, some of our members attended the annual assembly held by the Calgary Alliance for the Common Good, and myself and others met with these partners last week, where we continued to have engaging conversations, including the discussions around Indigenous liaison officers in each of our 8 districts. And finally, we remain committed and are moving forward to becoming an anti-racist, equitable, and inclusive police service. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. And finally, just moving to 5.4, this is the crime update. And as you know, we do this in 2 parts. I'll turn it over first to Deputy Chief Aliff to talk about the investigative side of the house, and then back to Deputy Toffic again, just to talk about the operational trends.
Okay, thank you, Chief. Hello again, everybody. We are currently sitting at 3 homicides for the year. So the latest 2 occurring just this past long weekend and 1 last night. Part of that, we had not had 1 for 6 weeks. Our 5-year average for homicides in January and February is 2.8. So that puts us right around our 5-year average. The month of March typically sees between 0 and 2 homicides. And our homicide clearance rate for 2017 to 2021 is 75%. With an average of 18 files being cleared by our homicide unit each year. We had 17 shootings in Calgary in January, which is significantly higher than January 2021. So January 2021, we had 9. And the 5-year average for that month is 8, so we're slightly higher than the 5-year average. 11 of these incidents were targeted, but only 6 resulted in injury. The most significant shooting was the targeted homicide of Eric Riendo. And in 8 incidents, either the offender or victim was being monitored by our organized crime and offender management section, with another 3 incidents involving subjects under consideration for monitoring or management. A year-end analysis of Crime Gun revealed that while overall shootings were down by 17 incidents in 2021, so that's 112 down to 95, compared to the previous year, they were up from the 5-year average, which was 87. We did see a drop in organized crime-related shootings compared to previous years, and more than 2/3 of our shootings from last year have been cleared or closed, either by charge, insufficient evidence, or for other reasons. 1 out of 3 shootings from last year is still being investigated. Most shootings from last year, where the motivation was known to police, were motivated by either a personal grudge or a drug-based dispute. Targeted shootings accounted for 64% of that total. The slight majority of shootings in Calgary result in either injury or death, so about 53%, and 1/3 results in property damage. Provincially, there were 503 shooting events reported last year, which was down compared to 532 in 2020. About 1/3 resulted in injury. Almost 3/4 of shooting events are believed to have been targeted, which is slightly higher than Calgary's 64%. Across the province, 546 firearms were stolen in 114 break-in enters. Almost half of all stolen firearms in our province were untraceable. In firearm trafficking files, handguns were the most likely to be trafficked, followed by rifles, then shotguns. A total of 78 firearms were registered to 17 identified straw buyers. So straw buyer is somebody that will buy a firearm for somebody else. We've had 7 pharmacy robberies since January 1st, as well as 7 cannabis store robberies in 2022. We ended last year with 89 pharmacies and 29 cannabis stores, so it would appear robberies of cannabis stores may be picking up speed in 2022. Deputy Toffic already alluded to our domestic violence situation. So our sexual assault investigative unit was assigned 30 new files in January, which is slightly below the 5-year average of 35. We completed 7 sexual assault evidence kits in January. So comparatively, we completed 101 in all of 2021. That's an update.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks very much. I'll just keep it going with our bureau update. And we're going to focus them around the goals that were identified or strategic initiatives that were identified in the 2022 annual policing plan, which there was the decreasing violent crime by targeting firearm-related violence and robberies, decreasing property crime by targeting break-in enters and auto theft, supporting vulnerable persons and improving call diversion, which includes downtown safety, increasing road safety, and increasing our capacity to support major events. So our organization will be responsive to all of those priorities, as well as the new and ongoing trends that emerge. Some of the highlights from our last crime update include the Kijiji Buy-Sell Task Force, which has been operating. There is some crossover there between the pharmacy robberies, cannabis store robberies, and some of these takeover online property sale type robberies. We've seen 36 files that task force has taken over. They continue to advance those investigations, and often they involve seeking judicial authorizations to advance them. Just this past week, 2 of the cases were cleared with 7 new charges laid and several outstanding warrants executed. Efforts continue to make connections between the various robberies in play. We have also noticed a series you might have seen in a media statement around Amazon carjacking series. We've had 3 Amazon carjackings in January, with 1 offender who was arrested and charged as a result. Our District 5 General Investigative Unit has an operation running on that and are monitoring that very closely. We've engaged with Amazon and conducted the media availability there and interview in the interest of preventing further occurrences. We're watching that one closely. We have noticed a number of break and enter series occurring. One in particular that was interrupted by an operation run out of District 2, which resulted in the arrest of 2 prolific break and enter offenders, estimated to be responsible for up to 30 break and enters across the city. An additional offender was identified in relation to a glass smash break and enter series and is being addressed by our prolific offender engagement team. I know the chair spoke about the efforts around Operation East Side and the downtown safety. Just to give a bit of an update on that operation and how it's gone since. Things continue to progress there. We had some great cooperation with our partners, both with the City of Calgary and with our social serving agencies. As a result of all of the investigative components of that particular operation, we conducted search warrants on 4 tents. There was a total of 28 weapons seized, along with a number of types of drugs. 12 suspects were arrested, totaling 71 criminal charges, in addition to 84 outstanding criminal warrants. The follow-up to that was a subsequent arrest, and the investigation continued even past the addressing of the encampment area aspect. And as a result of that, 2 individuals were arrested and charged with a number of offenses. Though that investigation was in relation to the controlling of the supply of illicit substances being trafficked by way of violence and intimidation. The success of the interagency cooperation, I think, is important to note. We had, in speaking with the drop-in center and partners, we had reported as of last week, 36 people connected with more than 97 services. That includes health services for 15 individuals, a number who received vaccinations and who began treatment for opioid addictions, 21 people who are connected to housing supports by way of viewing apartments and or assistance with applications for housing, 8 people who received assistance with obtaining identification, which is often a requirement and a barrier to people who need to access housing. 7 people were assisted with their taxes, which connects them with additional resourcing that they can access. And 2 families were reunited. Some of these people were actually in from out of province and actually needed to get to their home to be with family to support them in addressing some of their challenges. And those were facilitated through our partnerships. So one in particular was a couple who was assessed by the DI Housing Client Storage Project, as they had a lot of possessions. They had to ensure that they had been kept safe while they're looking for housing. So lots of follow-up going on there. Great work collaboratively. Moving on to the LRT, social disorder and safety. We are partnered with Calgary Transit to address the ongoing social disorder that we see along the transit lines. We have a number of operations going across the majority of districts. Actually, 6 out of the 8 districts have operations going to address social disorder around LRT platforms and the communities that surround them. In addition to that, we've partnered with Transit to do daily proactive patrols of the LRT trains during the day, during the most frequent ridership times, Monday to Friday, just to increase rider safety and to address any outstanding criminal issues or social disorder issues. Preliminary results of that effort have been very positive to date. Lastly, I'll just cover off some of the categories that we're seeing. We already spoke about domestic violence. Residential break and enters are down 7% as per the 5-year average at this point of the year. Commercial break and enters are down 10% still, but you see it's trending more toward, we were around the 28% to 30% in prior months. So we're seeing it come closer to the norm, what we typically see. Same with vehicle theft, which is 11% below, and car prowling's at 8%. So I'll leave it there as far as the crime update, and certainly we'll be open to any questions across the variety of topics.
Thanks, Deputy Tofik. Back to you, Chair, for questions.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to the commissioners. My questions were answered, so thank you for the reports. Commissioner Rossell.
Thank you. I just had a question about the encampment at McDermott Way. Just can you share a little bit about what's being done to make sure that that doesn't happen again, that we don't end up in a year's time or 6 months time, you know, with the same situation happening?
Absolutely. Oh, you bet, Commissioner. Thanks for the question. There's ongoing work collaboratively, and that was one of the biggest things that we wanted to make clear as an objective going into that partnership, was to make sure that we followed through thereafter. So the efforts continue beyond the date where we did all that work. So I can tell you that there's regular meetings among stakeholders to make sure that it stays free from barriers for people to get access, as well. Post main operation on the day, all the stakeholders came together this past week to do a bit of a debrief and look at what lessons we learned as a result of going through that. One of the key takeaways was that we need to stay on this as a collective. So I can tell you there's very strong commitment, both from our organization, I know bylaw as well, and our partners in social serving agencies to keep that open.
Thank you.
Commissioner Siddiqui.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner Russell took my first question. But my second question is, can you, you made a comment regarding recruitment at the first part of the presentation that you'll meet your 2022 goals. Can you just give the number that you're looking at recruiting for this year?
Hi, Commissioners. Rory Thompson here. So our number is 135. We're going to achieve that by a minimum of 5 recruit classes of 24, plus a minimum of 2 DEO classes, which will be 12. So obviously doing the math, that pulls us in at around just over 150, which gives us a bit of flexibility there, provided we don't fill all the classes to that 24. We had a class start last week, and they had 21 in it. And the next class is scheduled for April.
Awesome. And is that by December 2022 then?
That's correct. 31st. Give us all the days we need.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Commissioner Walcott.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your presentations. Just a quick question to the Chair. For the sake of time, I guess, would it be appropriate if I just go? I have questions for 5.2 and 5.4. Is it okay if I just do them back to back?
Absolutely. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Really appreciate that. I guess I'm in a unique position, so I'm wearing kind of 2 hats right now a little bit as the counsel for the ward in which most of the protests are happening in downtown, as well as being on police commission. So I just had a couple questions around the tickets that were issued, especially the one on the February 9th, if my memory serves. Sorry, I forgot to write down the date. The 30 on-site, 50 mailed. I was wondering if you could just quickly just talk to me about the scope and nature of the tickets. Like, was it noise, traffic obstructions? Like, what were the types of issues you were seeing?
Thanks for the question, Commissioner and Councillor. It was really a wide variety of offenses, largely under the Traffic Safety Act. Everything from fail to stop for police officer, which is a requirement. They, like I said, were uncooperative with our traffic officers who were attended and wouldn't adhere to the requirement to pull over and things of that nature, all the way to just, not following rules of the road, whether it be stop sign violation, red light violation, those types of things, as well as some of them wouldn't have had necessarily the right documentation for vehicles, insurance, registration, all of those types of things. So it's a wide variety. So it's whatever happened in front of them that caused them to be brought to our attention. Okay,
no, that's good to know. I was trying to figure it out myself, just if it was kind of like a particular bylaw that was used to enforce, or if it was arranged. So that's really good to know. To follow up on that, it switches really to the demonstrations that are at the kind of the heart of what we see here in Calgary, which are the kind of Central Memorial Park and then the March to the Beltline that have been ongoing for some time now. They're part and parcel with the convoy that we saw as well too. So I've seen long stretches of periods of like extended honking around Central Memorial Park. There's vehicles like they're blocking lanes that I've witnessed myself. So essentially, I'm curious is really to speak on the concept of tickets. Have we been issuing tickets throughout the weekly protests? Because I haven't actually heard much of reporting on those particular ones versus the February 9th convoy.
Sure, I can respond to that, Commissioner. Thank you for the question. The enforcement around those really depends on the circumstances that are happening right in front of them. Also, it also depends on the staffing that we have available to address what's going on. Generally speaking, with a lot of those larger scale protests where we're dealing with 3,000 plus people, it's about trying to contain it and keep it in a moving safely and to keep it moving, quite frankly. Ultimately, we don't want to have any conflict or engagement with people that would lead to other issues. We bring in a lot of different resources to have to attend to those type of demonstrations and protests to keep them safe. So we do have members of our traffic section who participate. We do have in recent weeks mounted unit assisting, mountain bike teams and beat teams from District 1 specifically because of the location where they tend to happen. We also have been paying attention to whether we're getting those types of complaints. I think a lot of people have expected a certain amount of noise with those types of demonstrations and marches. We've seen them with a variety of types of marches. However, I think it's due to the frequency and the repetitive nature of this one that's causing some of the more recent angst. So as far as the enforcement around traffic stuff, it's a lot of the noise we've been seeing it's more pedestrian foot traffic with those demonstrations. Unlike north of us to about 300 kilometers where they had an injunction there. I know with their protest, they had over 600 vehicles in one and there was honking and such that caused some other action to be taken. But at this point, it's been more reactive to what we see in front of us, and there hasn't been a huge amount just for honking, because often it's difficult to prove that that's an offense versus just letting people know that they're there or a vehicle, that type of thing.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. To build on it a little bit, and I caution the question that I'm not sure how we might go about answering this. This kind of depends on if the conversations have been had. But is there an awareness of unlawful behavior at the protest that isn't being enforced due to the requirements and concerns that are the primary concerns of public safety or other reasons? Speaking specifically to the potential reality that could be like 20, 30 officers and a crowd of 3,000-4,000 maybe.
You bet. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I can certainly respond to that. And oftentimes in situations like that, if it's reported to us, we will investigate it and follow it up. It may not be at the time. As an example, I believe even at last week's protest, there were a couple different interactions that were investigated. And it's not always the protesters. Sometimes it's counter protesters that engage with protesters. So we will investigate, follow up with those. And if it's not able to be done at the time, we certainly would do it thereafter. But we would encourage people to, if anything like that happens, to contact Calgary 911 through our, whether it's emergency or non-emergency line, and we will investigate that.
Thank you. Final question for this item, and it's just following up on a question that was asked in, I think it was last month's meeting or maybe December. But is there a rolling cost that is to the police escorts in the downtown protesters? I know the 2021 number came in around 2 million. I'm not sure if we're doing a month-to-month kind of count, given the prolonged nature of what we're seeing.
Yeah, thanks for the question. We projected 2 million. The total cost came in at 1.9 million.
Okay, that's for 2021.
Yeah.
And have we continued that projection month in the next 2 months into January, and now we're 23 days into February, still dealing with it as well too?
We are doing costing. We haven't done the projection yet for 2022 as of yet.
Okay, we'll follow up with that another time. Okay, the for agenda item 5.4, in particular around Operation Eastside, I really just actually wanted to comment on how successful that particular operation was, and it's in particular the efforts for communication that were really like they really expanded, ensuring that like the different conversations of stakeholders came in, the ways that council was brought into this conversation so that we can engage with the community. I really just wanted to say that that was a huge communication win, let alone an operational win. So I just want to express some gratitude for the work that was done there. So I'll kind of put a pause there because I really do just want to say thank you for that. The question that comes out of it is that these types of operations in the public, in the community's eye, it seems like there's kind of cascading impacts in the form of like displacement, right? We remove people from, not everybody, but we've especially removed a location of funneling of people to place encampments that has been displaced to other areas throughout the community, or at least that's the perception of it. Is this something that's considered part of the ongoing nature of these investigations? Is it how to mitigate the potential kind of spillover into neighboring communities?
Thanks, Commissioner, for the question. Absolutely. We look at, that was something we were very alive to, is potential displacement. Ideally, we wanted to connect as many people with support resources as possible so that it's not a displacement issue. But we know that the displacement already happened given the violent activity that was happening in the core there. So our hope is that by eliminating that and reducing the barriers to access services, that some of the people that might not have accessed them before will be able to be connected in. So as we see these encampments across the other districts, those are the things that we would be trying to connect people with services to, engagement of the DOPE teams, that type of thing to support that.
Okay, no, that's a really good perspective that the displacement that we were seeing was a result of the encampments that were on Dermot Baldwin Way, and the hope that clearing this up might see people in other places return to those resources. Okay, that's also something that I'll follow up on, probably with both hats on as well too. Agenda item 5.4, the BIS report. This one is something that I will admit I have the least familiarity with. So this is where I really do look for your guidance. But I was wondering if it's possible, because I know that we've discussed kind of the community policing models and a lot of the with the public safety task force that came out in previous years that wasn't intentionally around looking at gun violence, but it definitely ended up kind of being a part of that conversation around gun violence before. In this report, there's a pretty significant disproportionate number of Black individuals as both the victims of gun violence and as offenders. And I'm just curious if you could possibly provide a little insight into what factors might come into play when looking at those numbers, given the work that has been undertaken over the last couple of years regarding public safety and gun violence.
I think this may dovetail, Councillor Walcott, with the presentation that Jeff is going to give after in the closed in relation. Okay. Yeah, I think that might get answered there. So just in the interest of time, if you're good with that, I think we could defer that and address it there.
Absolutely. And please, if my next two questions are the same thing, I'm happy to discuss this in closed. But the next one was really, again, I wanted some insight in that public, because for that document that's facing the public, just to clarify, it says just across the province, 546 firearms were stolen and 114 breaking and entered. And then it said almost half of the stolen firearms are untraceable. I was just curious if you could give some insight to the public. And again, if this is something that's in the closed session, please feel free to do, but how a legally owned gun is untraceable.
Thanks for the question. That's pretty straightforward. It will have markings and serial numbers, and anything that would allow it to be traced back to its origin or its owner or a place of business would have been removed.
Oh, sorry. And if it was it said that 40% of them are untraceable. So that's how it'd be traced. So
yeah.
Given that like they're coming from B&Es though, for some legal owners, what is it about them that makes them untraceable?
So the break-in enters themselves, that people would come into possession of them, they might not be registered. They would have, so specifically one I was reading today from a break-in enter where 3 firearms were stolen. They'd been with that family for a number of years, but they had no discernible markings, and you couldn't trace them back, and they were not registered.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just add there that I think since the dismantling of the firearms registry for long guns, now, you know, we do see a lot of break and enters where owners don't know the serial numbers. And often, as Ryan referred to, when they fall into the hands of criminals, sometimes the serial numbers will be filed off. So you can't anyway. But I think the bigger proportion of those would be, of the 546 would likely be long guns. And a lot of those would just simply, the owners just didn't have the serial numbers, which is very unfortunate in terms of the tracing, but that's the reality now.
Okay, absolutely. Okay, I might take that away for a separate, again, different hat for us to advocate for somewhere else. But that's all of my questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner Walcott. Commissioner Campbell.
Thanks very much, Chair. I just wanted to follow up on Councillor Walcott's comments with respect to the ongoing protests, demonstrations, marches, rallies that have been occurring, and the population that attends them, and the ongoing, I would say, personal safety issue that this is now turning into for many Calgarians. We know that Calgary has had the unfortunate situation where these marches and rallies have been going on since March 2020. We've had 2 years of this, and they've only continued to grow in size. We know some of the participants are now known criminals. Thank you, CPS, for making that occur. But we also know that they participated in Ottawa, they participated down in Coutts, and particularly given the severity of what happened in Coutts and the RCMP operation that revealed a significant amount of weapons, is there a different strategy for addressing the marches now, knowing those behaviors and recognizing that many of those folks are from Calgary and will continue to march in Calgary? In terms of personal safety, the rally participants are openly harassing community members. I went to pick up a prescription, and I had a man yell at me to take off my mask. So I yelled back at him to take off his pants and went about my business. But I can do that because I happen to have a certain size and presence about me. I would suggest that for other community members, they would not be so bold and would be quite upset by that type of situation and encounter. So looking to know if there are strategies that you can offer to the community to protect themselves as these rallies continue, and also is CPS looking to use a different strategy now that we know some of the behaviors and capacity and capabilities of the rally participants? Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Commissioner, and certainly do empathize with all Calgarians that are around that, you know, have to interact, and if it's impacting them for sure. Certainly, you know, we see with these large groups, there are some who are more aggressive than others, and when you're dealing with 3,000 people at its max, and we've been tracking the numbers on these protests, they varied from 300 or 200 to 300 up to about 5,000 and everything in between. So our major event and emergency management section monitors these pretty much daily to see what's changing as far as information we know about the groups, what they're planning to do. We'll try to liaise with the protest organizers to get the terms of engagement or what they're looking at doing. Ideally, they work with us, and we can support peaceful protest and demonstration because you know, obviously with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we want to protect that and ensure that that's safe to do so. However, if people are stepping outside of that, we are certainly willing to step into that. And as we've said before, it may not be at the time, it may be at a time thereafter or at post-event, or just based on a safety situation to do it in the most safest manner, just for the public and for our officers. But we do respond in all those cases. We have had limited actual complaints to us around that have come in through the traditional mechanism. I think for a lot of people, there's a lot of nuisance interactions that happen, and I can certainly see how that would be very frustrating. But we looked in with Calgary 911 over the past few weeks, and there haven't been a whole lot of those types of complaints coming through. So I'd encourage people that if they are, to let us know, we'll follow through. Certainly our tactics will evolve with time and what we see as far as our operational needs to respond. And we have to have the ability to scale up and scale down. If we have 300 people coming out, we probably don't need the same amount of resources deployed to it as if there's 3,000. So it's finding that right balance to provide for the greatest deal of public safety that we can. So hopefully that answers the question, but we are continually monitoring.
Okay, thank you for those questions and good comments. So with that, if there's nothing else for the reports from the commission, I'll move on into the next section of our agenda. I will also just acknowledge that we are about 1 hour over our scheduled time. However, I think it was a hugely valuable and important conversation. So with apologies to those who are having their timelines, including some of the public members and others, it was an important conversation. So we needed to go ahead with that. The next section of the agenda is the executive director's report. It's posted. Is there any questions for Executive Director Spicer? Hearing no questions, I will go ahead with the representative updates. We want to take a moment to hear from the commissioners who represent the commission on various associations and committees. So I'll start by calling on Commissioner Tsang to provide a report on the Alberta Association for Police Governance. Commissioner Tsang, anything to add?
Nothing to add. Just happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions for Commissioner Tsang? All right, and then following that is Commissioner Siddiqui for the Canadian Association for Police Governance.
No, my report is posted unless there's any questions.
Thank you. Any questions? No, and then I represent the commission on the Calgary Police Youth Foundation. Their next meeting will be middle of March, and there are no updates to provide for that. Is there questions? And finally, Commissioner North Pagan, who is our representative on the Alberta Law Enforcement Response Team's Civilian Advisory Committee. Commissioner Pagan.
I have nothing to report from last month, as our meeting this month was canceled and rescheduled for March the 3rd. That's the only update I have.
Great, thank you. Any questions? All right. Hearing none, I will thank everyone for their participation and conversation, and we'll move on to the public participation section of the agenda. So we will now invite public guests who registered to speak to do so. One of our staff will invite you to unmute yourself one at a time. As mentioned at the beginning of this meeting, we're using a new public participation process for the first time today. So I'm going to ask for a little patience, as I'm sure there'll be some bumps along the road, but we're hoping that this is a new way of doing things and will invite a little bit more participation along with the other things that we're doing. For those of you who registered to provide a presentation, you have 4 minutes to speak, followed by commissioners having an opportunity to ask brief clarifying questions if they have any. Those who register to ask a question have 2 minutes to speak, followed by a member of commission or the service to have a couple of minutes to respond. Please keep your comments to the topic you provided when you registered. We also cannot discuss any complaint about specific employee of the service or interaction with the police. If you'd like to discuss those things, a complaint against an officer, please contact the Public Complaint Director or the Calgary Police Service Professional Standards section. And finally, a reminder to members of the media that we will hear from the public first, then we'll hold a media availability for you after adjourning the public meeting. So I will ask our communications director to please put through the first speaker.
Thank you, Chair. Our first presenter is Ms. Alicia Jordan. She's doing a presentation on the role of policing in healing community trauma.
Thank you. Please go ahead, Ms. Jordan.
Hello, so I'll be giving you this presentation. My apologies, I am a terrible public speaker, so I might need to take a few seconds in between just to take a few deep breaths, but here we go. So in a recent media interview, Police Chief Neufeld mentioned that he wants to bring back pride to the Calgary Police, and I agree. I have a suggestion to make on this account. I would suggest to Police Chief Neufeld that our Calgary Police will regain their sense of pride as police officers when they retake their role as protectors and defenders of the weak and vulnerable. There is no pride to be found in violently attacking civilians who are in handcuffs, vulnerable, unarmed, and defenseless. There is no pride to be found in brutalizing young women, young men, and the children of our city. There is no pride to be found in acting as judge, jury, and executioner for people with mental health problems. And there is certainly no pride to be found in failing to hold your own officers accountable for their actions. My police chief has in the past suggested that the media is to blame for the current climate of mistrust and negativity surrounding police officers. He chooses to misdirect blame towards the media, despite the fact that he is very well aware of the actions of his own officers, which are the cause of the broken trust between the police and our community. To Chief Neufeld, I ask, where is the respect shown for victims of abuse who have suffered at the hands of your officers? Where is the acknowledgement of their pain? When have you, Chief Neufeld, ever spoken their names in respect and honored them for what they went through at your officers' hands? Let me be clear, Chief, you have not done enough to heal this community from the abuse done by members under your command. As a leader, you have not brought us accountability, and you have not brought us healing. And for that, I am ashamed. The fact is that you all, CPC and CPS, have failed to protect and defend the life and dignity of certain people in our community. And yet, you call yourselves our leaders and you want our trust. You who fail to be transparent in your actions, you who fail to be accountable. No, that is something you will have to re-earn. It is time for the police to get back to being the police. And that means 1, respecting the civilians that they serve. 2, acting to heal, not harm, the vulnerable members of our community. And 3, demonstrating sincere accountability for their past poor behavior. After all, as our police chief himself said in the last meeting, it is poor behavior that contradicts our values as a community, which we must discipline. It should be mentioned that being a police officer is not a right, it is a responsibility. In real life, Chief Neufeld, there is no thin blue line separating officers and civilians. Police officers are civilians, citizens, not only beholden to the same laws, but also the additional responsibilities that they have chosen to take on. I want to direct your attention to a recent quote from another young Calgarian who said, "We want justice. The youth of this city want to be assured that they are safe in this community. Are we safe in this community, or is it us against the police?" At the end of the day, it is my right as a citizen to 1, have my voice heard, and 2, have safety from violence, including police violence. These are not asks, these are rights. The youth of this city are no longer asking nicely for you all to do your jobs. We are now demanding it. It is our right and it is your duty. There is a scale of change that I believe is urgently required to rebuild the trust and confidence of Calgarians in their police that is not currently being reflected in the actions of the CPC or the CPS. As far as you are concerned, given the fact that your organizations have in the past been too slow to respond and take action, and given that this community is still working through real trauma caused by the police, this job of yours should be your #1 priority. I expect my representatives to go to bed asking themselves how they can personally contribute to improving transparency and accountability. And I expect my representatives to use their every waking moment to think about what they can do as individuals and within their respective roles to heal this community. I want to personally let you all know that performative action without substance, which in my personal opinion is what these meetings have largely been for the last year, this will no longer be tolerated by our community or your citizens. The main message is this: how we treat our neighbors, our fellow Calgarians, that matters. When you ignore your citizens' concerns, what values are you showing? When you traumatize those who need your help and treat their human dignity as worthless, what values are you showing? At the end of the day, there are consequences to these behaviors. These actions reflect who we all are. We need strong leaders who can heal our community. I sincerely hope you understand this message, and in the next year, you dedicate yourselves to producing results that reflect our community values.
Thank you, Ms. Jordan. I appreciate you taking the time to bring your concerns forward, and appreciate your well-articulated statements. Thank you very much. Can we please move on to the next caller, Mr. Eddie Sue?
Thank you, Chair. We have Mr. Eddie Sue, and he's doing a presentation on the impact of systemic racism in policing on the Asian community. Go ahead, Mr. Sue.
I see Mr. Sue is muted. Is there a way of undoing that?
We have asked him to unmute, but he has to unmute on his end.
Thanks.
Perhaps we'll go on to the next speaker, and I can follow up with him to make sure everything's okay on the technical side. Our next speaker is Mr. John Orr. He's the president of the Calgary Police Association, and he has a question on the conduct of police commission members. Go ahead, Mr. Orr.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is John Orr, and I am the president of the Calgary Police Association. I'm here to speak about and ask a question regarding the conduct of some police commission members during the aftermath of critical police incidents. As we are all aware and has been discussed at length, there was a critical incident over this past weekend in which members of the Calgary Police Service were forced to shoot an armed and violent person who had reportedly assaulted a citizen with a weapon and then attempted to stab several police officers. Every time police officers are placed in a position where lethal force must be used, it is undoubtedly tragic. A man is dead, and a family and community are left to mourn and are rightfully seeking answers which they deserve. What is often lost, and I appreciate you, Chair Cornett and Councillor Walcott, for mentioning it in the meeting today, is the impact these events have on our officers. The officers I represent selflessly serve their communities every day, and the last thing they ever want to do is find themselves in a situation where they must use lethal force to protect members of the public, themselves, and fellow police officers. In Alberta, we are fortunate to have a robust system to independently investigate these rare incidents to ensure that police officers acted according to the law, their training, and their mandate to protect the community, and to ultimately hold them accountable if they did not. These investigations can be complex and take time, which creates difficulties and gaps in information in the short term. What is not helpful is when leaders in the community, including members of the Calgary Police Commission, in the absence of knowledge or facts, inflame a situation by promoting misinformation. Since this incident, a small number of commissioners have promoted messaging on social media with zero evidence, suggesting that the police response to this incident was racially motivated. They have also promoted false information that the person who was shot was unarmed. They have liked posts referring to this tragic incident as the murder of a citizen. This fanning of the flames does nothing to help a community heal and only lends itself to further dividing the police and the communities they serve. Maybe this is their goal. The officers I represent are unable to publicly share information, including what actually happened, as they must adhere to rules which rightfully protect the integrity of the ongoing ACERT investigation. For a small number of commissioners to advance their own agendas by promoting false information is unacceptable. My question has two parts. First, in your view, is it appropriate for members of the Calgary Police Commission to promote inflammatory misinformation on social media regarding a Calgary police incident? Secondly, if it is not, does the Calgary Police Commission have policies or a code of conduct to hold those commissioners who do so accountable? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Orr. I'll put a response forward, and if there's other commissioners who need to respond, you can as well. Our policies do set the expectation that commissioners will protect the public confidence and trust in the integrity and objectivity of the commission, and personal views must be stated clearly. We do expect that the conversation and the communication in the public will be balanced. The commission is working on re-evaluating the processes and the policies we have around communication. And we have an ongoing conversation about how we do this to the best of our abilities, given that we are meant to represent both our own communities, the commission as well, and then other roles that we have in this city. So I understand and appreciate your concern. It is a concern to us, and we continue to have that conversation about what communications should be in balance between the objectivity while still allowing people to express themselves. I will leave it at that for now. If there are, and it is an ongoing conversation. If there's any other short response another commissioner would like to make, I'll open it up for that. Otherwise, we'll need to move on. Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Walcott.
Sorry, just a quick comment, and it's, I think most of it is along the lines of, it is a challenging position. I think that Mr. Orr has put the commission into and be able to answer his questions without specificity. You know, it's a collection of 12, you know, it's a collection of several people, and to utilize social media in any way, and can consider things like liking tweets to be inferences of suggestions and communication. It's a challenging, speculative place to put us in. So if that is a concern, I would just recommend maybe writing it out in a very particular email that could be directed to the chair for us to take away, and use it to inform some of the conversations that we're having offline. Just because I'm not sure that based off of the questions you provided and the line of questioning that have been here, is that if we even have the ability to provide the answer that you're seeking.
Thank you, Commissioner Walcott. And yes, I will emphasize again that it's an ongoing conversation over time, and we need to have these conversations. So, Mr. Orr, if you would like to bring that forward again for our conversation and specifics, we would be happy to entertain that. So thank you very much. And I appreciate your time tonight. Can we please move on to the next participant?
Thank you. The next participant is Ms. Shannon Henning. She has a question relating to the efforts to increase the number of Indigenous Relations officers. Please go ahead, Ms. Henning.
Thank you. I'm Shannon Hennig, and I'm here representing the Calgary Alliance for the Common Good. The Calgary Alliance, with its numerous Indigenous members and advisors, are asking the Calgary Police Commission to comply with the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit calls for justice released on June 2nd, 2019. The call to justice 9.4.1 says specialized Indigenous policing units are to be staffed with experienced and well-trained Indigenous investigators who will be the primary investigative teams and officers overseeing the investigation of cases involving Indigenous women, girls, and to SLGBTQIA people. It has now been 2.5 years since the Missing and Murdered Women and Indigenous Girls report was released, and very little has been accomplished. Yes, the CPS Indigenous Relations Office and Indigenous Anti-Racism Training for the entire CPS are part of the calls for justice in 9.4.1 and 3. but our Indigenous communities have told us they need more. We need the CPS to act on the calls to justice in 9.4.2. We need qualified and experienced Indigenous teams and officers working with Indigenous peoples. Our plan is to continue to team with the CPS on the ways that they are working towards the calls for justice. However, we are a community organization and our work is to apply pressure in the direction our Indigenous partners have indicated. That is why we will not stop pushing for experienced Indigenous liaison officers. When we met with CPS most recently on February 17th, they suggested again that Indigenous civilian young people be hired to become Indigenous liaison civilians and discover a career as a Calgary police officer. While this is an interesting and informative idea, the Indigenous liaison officers should be hired first and then the Indigenous liaison civilians later, division by division until there are 8 of each. When will the Calgary Police Commission get fully behind the initiative of hiring Indigenous liaison officers for each of Calgary's divisions and require that the Calgary Police Service do so in order to satisfy the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit calls for justice in 9.4.2? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And I'll ask the service if you have a quick response to this.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for your comments, and thanks for the comments around our ongoing meetings. We do continue to find value in those and continue to have great conversations. And so at the last meeting, we did in fact have the conversation again around the Indigenous liaison officers. We have committed to looking at a feasibility study in the districts with respect to the data that we attend with respect to Indigenous community members. So the biggest piece that we continue to have the conversation around is the mixed messaging that we certainly get from our elders, from different communities that we speak to. So there's a bit of a divide as to what and how many and where people want, if any, Indigenous liaison officers. So we continue to have those conversations with our Indigenous Advisory Board, with our elders, with others, and continue to just look at to see if that in fact is something that we should do. Of course, as was just mentioned, one of the pieces that we continue to have the concern around is our capacity and our resourcing. And although that's not an excuse, that is the reality. So as I said, we encourage these conversations, we continue to have them, and we continue to be at the table to see what is best for our Indigenous community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, and thank you for your response. We'll go to the final participant this evening.
Thank you, Chair. We do have 2 more if we can get through to Mr. Sue, but the first speaker will be Mr. Raj Khaitan. He has a question relating the anti-racism work. Go ahead.
Hi there. Good afternoon, or should I say good evening. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thanks.
I'd like to say thank you for allowing me to speak. Last month, I spoke about recruitment practices and anti-racism. I mentioned the best way to deal with anti-racism and issues of culture was for the police to be more representative of the community it serves. After I spoke, I was invited to the CPS headquarters to help identify some of the barriers. I must mention some of the immense work being done, and I thank you for the invite. But I noticed reform of the civilian police recruitment process is held back by many of the micro barriers. This is not in control of the police. It's done on the city side. Is the commission and councillors aware of this? I am raising this because this issue and the police, they're both joined at the hip when it comes down to civilian recruitment. These micro barriers, they stop reforms, and that's the very definition of institutional racism. I also have to ask if these processes that block the reforms on the civilian recruitment are compliant with the city's own EDI policy. It might even be in violation. So I do find it deeply concerning how we can ask our police to take on anti-racism measures, but then at the same time tie their hands. It makes no sense for a police anti-racism drive when attempts by the police to make positive changes on the civilian recruitment front is overruled by an outside process that itself discriminates. So my question is, will the Commission and councillors hold the city and police to account on this issue? In particular, can we log some of the pushback and reasoning given why changes cannot be made? This is so we can have an evidence-based audit trail.
Thank you for your question, Mr. Cretan. I will just provide a brief comment that is around recruitment and the process and systems there. We continue to have that as one of the priorities on our agenda at each and every monthly meeting we have with governance personnel, as well as our full commission meetings. And I think it's a valid point that you bring forward. And will continue to be something that we look at as we make progress from everything from having the strategies, the outcomes and metrics defined and then measured to those. It's a long-term process, and I think your point's very valid. I'd ask if there's any other commission members who would like to make a comment on this. Sorry, Commissioner Mellon.
Thank you. Through the chair, I would appreciate it, Chair, if you could invite our respondent to share a more detailed concern on that, to give us an idea of exactly what micro barriers he's referencing, which would equip us better, I think, to respond.
Yes, please. Mr. Katan, if you can provide us perhaps another specific example or detail.
Or even in writing later, Chair. It doesn't have to be, real time, but I think we do need to understand fully that.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can. I'm more than happy to put them more in writing and give you more details just for the sake of time. But yeah, I'm more than happy to do that.
Thank you. That would be very helpful. Commissioner Northpay again.
Yes, I just wanted to actually mention here that the recruiting process is a jurisdiction of the Provincial Police Act. So we should be actually advocating to that, because I ceiling out on trying to initiate these kind of changes at the municipal and local level. So we actually need to start identifying what is provincial and what is municipal in order for this fight to be successful as an entire community. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Very valid point and a very good reminder. Much appreciated. Thank you for that. And thank you for the question and for the time you took to follow up from your last question last month. Much appreciated. And I'll move on then to our last participant, Mr. Sue.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Sue, if you are there, you can unmute now and speak.
Mr. Sue's presentation is Impact of Systemic Racism in Policing on Asian People. Please go ahead.
Chair, I've been unable to get a hold of him, and so I'll just reach out to him and ask for a written submission because it appears we're having technical issues.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Excellent. All right, well, that concludes the public part of our meeting this evening. We'll move on to the media question and answer. And I will say that the commissioners are welcome to stay or take a short break if you would like to. And the other members of the public will, I guess they are gone or soon will be. And then we'll move on with media. And I think we will rejoin then, I would say, it's hard to estimate how long this is going to take. And we're so far behind in our agenda. It's really hard to guess.
Chair, we only have two reporters who have registered to ask questions, so it should be relatively short.
Okay, so perhaps we can aim for the media and then a brief break and convene at 6:30. Will that work? Okay, and remember, you need to log out of this one into the next one. Perfect. All right, so we'll move on to media availability.
Thank you, Chair and Chief. And so I do see Bill Coughlin's raised his hand, so we'll sneak him in and have three, but we will start with Adam McVicker from Global News. Adam, I'll allow you to talk here.
Hi there. I'm not sure who best to direct this question to, but obviously a lot of questions today about the incident that happened over the weekend. I was wondering how the commission feels regarding the answers to those questions that were asked earlier today.
It's a good question. I would say that we appreciate the answers today. There is a lot of work that's been done that needs to happen in the future. It was a tragedy for everyone on the weekend, and that's something that is absolutely and completely acknowledged by the commission. We also know that we need to both look forward to hearing the results of the ACERT investigation. So that's one piece of it. At the same time, there are other things that can be looked at from a systemic perspective around training, de-escalation, some of the cultural sensitivity and other things like that. So I will say that I very much appreciate the conversation that was started today and know that there's conversation that needs to carry on. I'll ask the service if you had any other questions, although that one was directed specifically to the commission, I believe.
Yeah, any follow-ups, Adam?
I'm good for right now, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We will move on to Kevin Green. If you are still here, I don't see you though. So Bill, we'll go on to you.
Hi. Yeah, I'm just wondering, I think this question would be to Chief Neufeld. Where is the CPS right now in ensuring mental health experts, mental health resources are at hand when these kinds of issues arise? How easily can they be mobilized and deployed in these kinds of situations?
Thanks for the question, Bill. I'm going to turn you over to Deputy Chief McClellan. He's going to talk a little bit about the PACT and the MRT and the things that we've done here to upscale the amount of capacity we have there.
Yeah, thanks, Chief. Thanks very much for the question. It's a great question, and just in alignment with all the conversations that we've had here today and over this past weekend, and just throughout these last couple of years, this is a priority for us. With our CSIF money and the investments that we made, we were able to double our PACT team, so our police officers and mental health crisis workers. I don't have specific numbers here today for you, but I can tell you anecdotally that with that doubling of the team and them being able to work 24/7, they have had an impact. They have been able to take call load off of our frontline officers where it would normally have been them, that the mental health worker and the police officer are showing up and providing them the appropriate resources. In addition, the mobile response team out of 211, where our members are able to call into there and ask about the client that they're dealing with. Not too long ago, they had limited hours as well, but because of our investment through CSIF, that also is 24/7. And of course, our recent initiative with our 211 partners in 911. Again, just some great stories over this last very short couple of weeks, where there have been calls that have been diverted away from police, and the 211 workers have been able to give the appropriate resources, give the appropriate advice to those people in crisis. Of course, as we've always said, the ultimate call at the end of the day is with this pilot project is when somebody calls 911, it's for fire, police, EMS, or somebody that's able to assist in with respect to someone who's dealing with a mental health crisis. We're working on many, many initiatives behind the scenes to continue to enhance that. And we recognize with all of our partners, all of our stakeholders, all of our community members, that we have to have alternative call response, call diversion to ensure that we are getting the right resources to the right people at the right time. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Any follow-up, Bill?
Yes. I know that in the incident on Saturday, allegedly, the deceased, was assaulted officers with a weapon, or at least, threatened officers or lunged at officers with a weapon. I know that's the allegation. But aside from that, I'm wondering what the policy is, CPS policy is, for using fatal force when a suspect is attacking or injuring a police service dog.
There a response from the service on that?
I guess I would just say, Bill, we don't have a policy in particular with respect to somebody attacking a dog. There is, though, an offense in the criminal code. I believe there has been since 2015 or 2016 called Quanto's Law, Quanto's Law. It's an offense to actually attack a service animal. So that's present. But I think, a little bit of what we're talking about here is, which resources would be brought to the scene is predicated on, I guess, the ability to communicate with an individual and be able to stabilize situations so that those resources can understand, who's involved, be able to access records, medical records, and this type of thing to add some value to that assessment. And until you can stabilize the situation, very difficult to do any of that.
Okay. Anything else, Bill, or are you?
Oh, that's good. Thank you.
Perfect. Excellent. I'll go back to you, Adam, for one more follow-up, and then Kevin, I see you now, and so we'll end with you. So Adam, you go ahead.
Thank you. And this was just a quick one, maybe to the police service. What kind of resources are available for officers in situations like this, where perhaps different language, there's a barrier with communication with language, perhaps? What kind of resources are available in that situation?
Adam, I'm going to turn you over to Inspector Nadine Wagner. Inspector Wagner's in CCLC, our Chief Crowfoot Learning Center now, but actually works recently and then once in a while in our real-time operations center. So she can help us out with that one.
Chief, and thank you for the question. We have a active interpreter list that continues to be accessible in real time when our officers come into a challenge with communication. But I can also tell you how innovative they are in regards to downloading apps and getting easy or common language or phrases interpreted on their phones, and then they can, use that to correspond with any community member in public to find that common ground and to determine why we're there, and then work on providing additional resources to continue that conversation to support them receiving the service they need.
Okay, does that answer your question, Adam?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. Okay, and we will end with you, Kevin, if you'd like to go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me now?
We can hear you now, yes.
I apologize if something like this has been asked. I had to step away from the meeting for just a few minutes at the top of the clock. This is a question for the chief, and it deals with the shooting on the weekend. I think the best way to just start this is to say I've been speaking with members of the South Sudanese Community Association today, and I'll just give you a quote from one of them, and it's representative of what I heard from most of them. Here's the quote. "It was a racially motivated action to one of the members of our community. If he was not Black, he would have been approached differently, and he would have also been treated differently." That's not a unique sentiment from what I found today, and I'm wondering how the chief and how the service responds to that.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I would say that that's consistent with what we've heard as well in some of our communications with the community. I think there's no question, and it's completely understandable that there's a lot of people grieving and mourning right now. We've reached out to the community through a number of sources, and we will be meeting at the appropriate time. I think it's also fair to say there has been a fair bit of misinformation circulating out in the conventional media and the social media world as well, which has formed some opinions. And I think as we go forward here, and we're going to be able to get in a room together and be able to talk about some of the features and some of the things that have gone on here. I think some perspective sharing on both sides is going to be really important. Right now, I think that's what we're seeing is quotes in the media and that sort of thing from people at a very emotional time. And so, and that's very fair. I think that is representative of what you're hearing. So we look forward to being able to have those conversations at the appropriate time, driven by the community's timeline about, what are those particular areas where there are concerns and what's the reason for those beliefs that Mr. Tuel would have been treated differently or handled differently than another person because of the color of his skin. So we look forward to those conversations at the appropriate time. Thanks for the question.
And any follow-ups, Kevin?
Yeah, I just want to follow up by asking to Chief, are you confident in this case that race was not an issue with your officers or with the use of force?
What I can tell you is this, in terms of this situation being motivated by individual racism or institutional racism, yes, I'm confident. In terms of whether there were factors that led to Mr. Tuel or others not being able to access services or whatever. So what I'm talking about, was there systemic barriers or systemic discrimination that led to this situation at some other point? That may very well be. But in terms of the officers who responded to this situation and the manner in which they responded, I'm absolutely confident this did not have anything to do with the color of Mr. Tuel's skin.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. And Chair, that concludes our media Q&A.